not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's Monday, the 11th of December. Coming up today.
Rwanda, crunch time. As we speak, groups representing 100 backbench Tory MPs are meeting, perhaps plotting, deciding how to act on tomorrow's crucial Rwanda vote. Without these MPs on board, the bill will surely fail. We'll bring you the verdict this very hour.
Boris under the bus? Has the Prime Minister thrown his predecessor under the proverbial bus? Well, Rishi Sunak is facing a grilling from the COVID inquiry today, and he's been talking about that first lockdown. We'll have the very latest as Sunak allegedly claims that Boris Johnson was the ultimate sole decision-maker regarding COVID policy.
And what's next for Nige after taking the bronze in the jungle? GB News' Nigel Farage hints of a return to frontline politics, launching scathing attacks on both the leadership of the Conservatives and the Labour Party. Could he launch a third comeback?
And of course, as we speak, that meeting of those 5 different groups representing 100 Conservative backbenchers, described to be perhaps on the right of the party. These include groups like the European Research Group, the Growth Group, and the New Conservatives Group as well. The Common Sense Group as well. But crucially, we're going to hear their verdict this hour in terms of whether or not these groups will all act as one. No doubt there'll be some people that take different views, but the leadership of these groups really matters when it comes to tomorrow's vote. Could it undermine the entire process, or might they be playing a longer game?
Yes, and they've got this group of lawyers who have been looking at the legislation line by line, deciding whether it is watertight enough and whether it will deal with the issue of stopping the boats. It seems as though they're saying that it won't, but that doesn't mean the MPs won't still vote through this legislation, but they will be deciding today ahead of tomorrow's vote.
Absolutely, and there is a third way, a middle option here, not just to vote against it or vote for it. They could abstain, or they could have sought assurances from the government to vote for it at what's known as second reading and then change it when it gets to committee stage, report stage in the House of Commons. Could they tighten it up after the vote? So much to discuss there, and we'll be live in Parliament with the verdict of all of these groups this very hour.
And of course, Rishi Sunak, he's busy in the COVID inquiry while all of this is going on behind his back. And this could be crunch time, not only for Rwanda, but for his premiership.
Well, we'll get to all of that after your bulletins with Tamsin.
Tom, thank you, and good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 2 minutes past 12. The Prime Minister has defended what he called a vigorous debate among senior government figures during the pandemic, saying it was appropriate when undertaking such consequential decisions. Rishi Sunak began giving evidence at the COVID inquiry with an apology to those who lost loved ones. However, he played down suggestions by Hugo Keith KC that severe inefficiencies in Downing Street had led to a chaotic style of governance.
Were you aware that his closest advisers had seemingly unanimously taken the view that there was a lack of efficiency? The administration is described privately as brutal and useless, or criminally incompetent, or operationally chaotic.
The fact that there was debate and that people were passionate about it and they had different points of view is I think, A, unsurprising, and B, good, because it would be worse if we were having this conversation and all the commentary was, well, there was no debate about any of this whatsoever. It was all just signed off straightforward. Someone put a piece of paper, someone checked, and that was the last we heard of it. I think that would actually be far worse, quite frankly. It's good that there was debate about these things.
GB News understands 5 groups of Tory backbenchers will give their verdict shortly on the government's plan to send migrants to Rwanda. That's as the bill heads for a crunch vote tomorrow in what's set to be an important week for the Prime Minister. Gary Lineker is among several high-profile personalities who signed a letter describing the policy as uncaring, chaotic and costly. Defence Secretary Grant Shapps says he should stick to football.
What is moral about allowing criminal gangs to put people's lives at risk for large sums of money by trafficking them across the English Channel? What on earth has got into anyone's minds to think that we shouldn't challenge or tackle that disgusting trade in human misery? And so, again, unless he, Labour or anyone else have got a better plan, at least we're putting plans in place which are starting to have success, slashed by a third, and would do more in the future.
Parents and teachers say the regulation of schools should be more transparent and less high stakes, according to a new report. It found that 42% of parents support more transparency in how Ofsted judges schools, with respondents also in favour of more frequent inspections. The report by policy consultancy Public First comes after a coroner found that an Ofsted inspection likely contributed to the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. The United Nations is experiencing one of its worst funding shortfalls in years, after just over a third of its required aid budget was provided last year. Humanitarian crises were estimated to cost around $57 billion over the last 12 months as conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine worsened. However, after receiving just a fraction of that amount, the UN is now lowering its expectation for the year ahead with today's appeal for $46 billion. Aid chiefs say it's difficult to decrease aid budgets amid intensifying global conflicts while staying realistic about what's needed. Meanwhile, Israel's war against Hamas is pressing ahead amid warnings that conditions in Gaza are worsening. The World Health Organization says the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza is becoming almost impossible to resolve. Officials say the UN is likely to vote tomorrow on a draft resolution that would demand a ceasefire. Taxes have soared to the highest rate on record, raising concerns over Britain's ability to attract business and investment. New data shows property taxes are among the highest across the developed world, with the Office for Budget Responsibility signalling further hikes to come. A spokesperson for the Treasury insists the UK remains competitive, but Labour says taxpayers are being punished for the government's economic failures. Dengue fever could become a national domestic disease in England by 2060 because of climate change. Government health experts say warmer conditions are to blame for the spread of the Asian tiger mosquito, known for its potential of the spread of the disease. The UK Health Security Agency warns the mosquito could become commonplace across England over the next 2 to 3 decades. Officials say warmer weather brings a higher risk of several diseases and more pandemics. Now, if you're driving home for Christmas, experts say you'd better plan ahead. With Christmas falling on a Monday this year, the AA predicts Friday the 22nd and Saturday the 23rd to be the busiest days for traffic. Around 16.1 million car journeys are expected to take place across the UK during the festive weekend. This is GB News across the UK, on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker. Just say play GB News. Now, back to Tom and Emily.
Well, as we were discussing, as the Prime Minister gives evidence at the COVID inquiry, pressure is building from his own MPs over the controversial Rwanda plan.
Yes, Rishi Sunak faces a crunch vote in Parliament tomorrow, where both the left and indeed the right wings of his own party have threatened to derail this vote.
Huge amounts going on. Let's get the very latest from our political editor, Christopher Hope, who is live from Westminster. Christopher, great to see you. Can you bring us the latest? You've been documenting which Tory MPs are going into this meeting to decide what to do when it comes to this legislation.
Yeah, I dashed back here for this bulletin for your show, Tom and Emily. Yeah, Sir Bill Cash arrived with a manila folder, which is covered up from the cameras and peeping toms like me, which in there contains the 12-page or 10-page assessment of the so-called Star Chamber group of Tory MPs, right-wing Tory MPs. They are working out whether this Rwanda bill can stop the boats. Mark Francois told GBNews earlier today that if he can't stop the boats, and that's an absolute position, not reduce them by 30%, stop them, then it's very hard to see how the MPs can support it. Following him was Mark Francois, as I said, he's the chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs. Richard Drax MP first in there from the right. Around 100 MPs are due to be meeting there. We're expecting a statement on camera at 12:45 p.m, which of course we'll bring to you as soon as we can on GB News, if not then or at 1 o'clock. And no question, Rishi Sunak, the PM, is in the wrong place today. He's in Paddington discussing his time as Chancellor when he was trying to deal with the pandemic, Eat Out to Help Out, the furlough scheme, keeping lots of the businesses ticking over while they were put into hibernation during that dreadful time for so many people. But really, his future has been being decided not at the inquiry, but right now in Westminster, where MPs, if enough vote against this tomorrow, more than 28, it'll be the first government defeat on second reading at a bill in nearly 30 years. More likely is abstentions and amending. Right now, this lunchtime policy exchange, a right-wing think tank, has published a list of amendments that could be made to make the Rwanda bill work. I think MPs will be looking at it very closely. The reason why finally, Tom and Emily, they've decided right now to come out with their verdict, the right-wingers, they want 36 hours to negotiate with the government. The vote is tomorrow night at 7 p.m. The next 36 hours are crucial for the immediate future of this government.
It's fascinating to look at what's happening over the last 2 days. A frantic ring-round operation from Tory whips and these two new migration ministers in the Home Office. Christopher, what's your understanding in terms of what the government has been saying to these 100 or so MPs who could be the difference between this bill passing and it failing? What are they offering?
Well, Tom, it's not just these 100 right-wingers, but it's 100 on the left of the party. The Tory party divides into three, left, right and in the middle, about 100 each or so. The 100 tonight are meeting, they're called the One Nation Caucus. Now, they're concerned it goes too far the other way, moving away from the protection of the ECHR and human rights. Let's see that for later on, though. But right now, the right-wingers, that's right, they've been offered, also, no doubt, I mean, this is what will have happened, I don't know for sure, but typically offered preferment in future, if there are reshuffle, future jobs come up, chance there, maybe a knighthood if you're a senior MP leaving Parliament, a damehood for the female Tory MPs leaving Parliament, just to show loyalty. There's all sorts of, in the bottom drawer of the whips, Tom and Emily, there's all sorts of presents they can offer out. It is Christmas after all, but what they want to get is a big number supporting this bill, because as you know, Tom, you're a student of politics like I am. Without a massive majority supporting it at a second reading, peers in the House of Lords, we haven't even discussed them, they'll feel emboldened to amend this, change this bill, water it down as much as they can. The government needs a massive majority tomorrow to make it work, and it's looking dicey even at this stage.
It's slightly unfortunate for the Prime Minister that he's stuck at the COVID inquiry. Surely he should be out schmoozing his backbench MPs to try and make sure that they vote with him tomorrow.
Well, there's no question he'll be watching your reports at 1 o'clock today on our channel, trying to find out what happened, what are we saying about it, what next. He should be here and wants to be here, but he can't be. He's got to respect the COVID inquiry. Of course, him appearing today is right, because Boris Johnson appeared on the last two sitting days of inquiry, Wednesday, Thursday last week. It's quite natural that Sunak is the next one, because he was the Chancellor to Boris's PM during the pandemic. So quite normal this should happen. Of course, the government chooses when it has votes itself. The government could have had this published this bill, couldn't they, 3 weeks ago when that Supreme Court ruling came out. Instead, they weren't. They appeared to be caught surprised by that.
Yeah.
And they've waited 3 weeks, more time ticking, and the deadline is May next year, when the PM has told us repeatedly that is when these planes will take off with Rwandan asylum seekers. There's not a lot of time left. They're going to go through the amendment stage in the new year.
Yeah.
Then it's the House of Lords. Then there's all sorts of recesses. Whether there's time or not, we'll wait and see.
Well, Chris, we'll let you scurry quickly back to Portcullis House on the parliamentary estate to press your ear against that door to the committee room and hear what's going on. We'll also be live there in Parliament in around half an hour's time for the verdict. It's all happening here. But, Chris, for now, thank you so much for joining us and updating us.
Yes, we're now joined by the political correspondent for The Spectator magazine, James Heal. James, thank you very much for joining us. You just heard what Christopher Hope had to say. You know all the movers and shakers in Westminster. What have you heard? Does it look like they're leaning towards this group of 100-odd MPs? Are they leaning towards backing this legislation?
Well, I think what's really indicative is what Chris was saying there about the policy exchange report, which actually does recommend amending the bill, but backing it tomorrow at second reading. And I think that's the conversation that's currently going on. As Chris said there, no government has been defeated on a second reading of a bill since 1986. That was the only time with a working majority in the 20th century. That was on Sunday Trading, Tom's favourite. I think basically that suggests that I think the hope is try and get it through the next week, try and get it through the second reading, and then come back after Christmas, after a long break, much needed break for some of those Tory troops, and they can try and amend it there. Two bits of news have just occurred to me in the past sort of 20 minutes or so. One is that Rishi Sunak is expected to hold a number 10 smoked salmon charm offensive for some of his MPs tomorrow. That was what you'd expect on Tuesday morning, just a few hours ahead of that vote in the evening. And the second piece of news is that the government is now expecting to publish its legal advice later today. That's an unusual step, but it shows just how willing Number 10 is to try and calm some of those fears on the Tory right about how strong this legislation is, and actually that it's going to work, because there's been a lot of talk, will it work, will the bill work? By publishing this legal advice, the government will hope to convince the waverers that actually they should go along with them, and that the ERG Star Chamber isn't the be-all and end-all.
It's a huge and unusual step for the government to publish this legal advice. I remember many rows over many pieces of legal advice on many different policy areas where the government's stock line will be, legal advice is confidential, we don't share this. This is a big step for the government to be taking. Are they worried?
Well, quite. And I think what's really overhanging all of this debate is the uncertainty, because we are in such novel constitutional waters here. I think actually, although there were a lot of lawyers that were critical of the government's plans when they were set out last Wednesday, the illegal migration changes, actually a lot of them were saying, frankly, this is a test case. We don't know if the Supreme Court would uphold this or not. So I think that it does show that that government is very concerned about all this. And also, really, there is a political element to all of it, because although we talk about the Star Chamber, it is true to say they've got legal expertise, but also it's a political court. And really, this is now a battle about politics as much as it is the law, and about trying to read the way in which the Tory mood is changing, the way in which the tribes are shaping up, and trying to ensure that keyword momentum is behind the government, ensuring that all the interventions over the next 24, 36 hours are helpful ones, and that MPs are lining up to back their bill rather than turn against it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, James Hill, their political correspondent for The Spectator. I believe we're going straight back to Christopher Hope, our political editor, who's in Westminster. Christopher, what have you got for us?
Yeah, Emily, Tom, the morning lobby meeting is broken up. Well, that's the spokesman for the Prime Minister briefs MPs in Westminster. The government's disclosed that this afternoon they are publishing the legal advice underlying its Rwanda bill. They're going to try and take go toe-to-toe with Tory MPs on the right of the party with its Star Chamber verdict. That's lawyers, its verdict on whether Rwanda works. They're going to put out their countering legal advice, so the two documents can be compared side by side. This is absolute, in the world of Westminster, a degree of warfare breaking out between the two lawyers on different sides ahead of tomorrow. It really is beefing up to be quite a big afternoon, I think, in politics today.
And it is worth underlining this point. I remember the Geoffrey Cox legal advice over the Brexit deal, the rows, the weeks of consternation about whether or not that should be published. And the government, in the end, doing this half-house sort of doing the summary publishing. Is it your understanding the government is not going to just publish a summary of this advice, but the advice in full? That would be a very remarkably unusual step.
And that's not happening for that reason, Tom. That never happens, really. We get summaries. Even I'm old enough to remember the Iraq War in 2003. That was a summary of legal advice, and that went through lots of iterations with freedom of information battles. But this very rarely happens. Viewers should understand this almost never happens. You see it during the Brexit battles. You saw it with the Iraq War. On big, massive issues for the government, when they want to win round recalcitrant MPs, they do this. This is a very rare moment, but it shows to me the seriousness with which they're taking the risk of losing tomorrow. That's what's happening here. This is what a government going to win, Emily and Tom, wouldn't be doing this.
Yes, and we'll be speaking to a lawyer later in the show, I believe, to see, because it's so hard to know which is the correct interpretation of this legislation. Will it stop the votes? Thank you very much indeed, Christopher Hope, our GB News political editor.
And we should underline it's less than half an hour now until we will be live outside that committee room in Parliament with the verdict of these 5 groups of Conservative MPs. Stay with us. It's an electric day in Westminster today.
Yes, and of course, the COVID inquiry continues. The Prime Minister is taking the hot seat today. Formerly, of course, the Chancellor at the time. Rishi Sunak has been giving advice throughout the morning.
Well, our reporter, Ray Addison, is live for us outside the inquiry. And Ray, what have we learned?
Well, Rishi Sunak started off this morning by saying he wanted to make a brief opening statement expressing how deeply sorry he was for those who had lost loved ones or suffered during the pandemic. He said he'd thought about it a lot over the last 2 years, and he said that today he would be giving his evidence in the spirit of constructive candour. Now, of course, the questioning actually started with the issue of the Prime Minister's missing WhatsApp messages. He had been asked to provide WhatsApp messages from his various mobile phones during the time period and hadn't been able to do so. This was all dealt with actually fairly quickly. He explained that he wasn't actually a prolific user of WhatsApp anyway, and he hadn't actually sent many during the pandemic. He also said he changed his phone multiple times and he just didn't have the messages backed up. He also pointed out that notes were formally recorded during the meeting, so Mr Sunak said it didn't really matter that he didn't have those messages. Now, he wasn't massively pressed on this, although he was asked by the KC leading the inquiry there whether he had ever received any advice or been told by any government officials that he should preserve those messages, and he said he did not recall being given that information. Now, one of the key issues that he was answering questions on today was the impact of decision making on the economy and public health. Of course, we know that he's faced accusations in the past. He's been criticised for prioritising the economy over the health of the population, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme as well being a key element of that. He said that most of the discussion about impacts on the economy actually happened after the first lockdown, as they had more data to look at and review, and that actually increased over time. He said it was his constitutional responsibility to provide advice to the Prime Minister on the financial impact, and that was where he would keep his focus during that advice. And he also said it was very hard to correctly predict any impact before that first lockdown, but they had a lot more to go on afterwards.
Some people might say the biggest mistakes were made in that bumpy period around the second half lockdown and the third lockdown. No doubt there'll be more on this later this afternoon. But for now, Ray, thank you so much for bringing us the very latest there from outside the COVID inquiry.
Yes, now after the break, we'll bring you more on the Rwanda scheme. The Prime Minister's party stand divided on whether they should back the flagship bill in tomorrow's vote. What's going to happen?
we're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back, and as promised, with all the noise surrounding the Rwanda plan, we want to know what's going on legally with this policy. We're going to ask what parts of the legislation, this emergency legislation on Rwanda, are causing the legal problems for the government.
Well, to help answer that question is the barrister and writer Stephen Barrett. And Stephen, welcome back to the programme. And I'm fascinated here because, of course, we've heard the verdict of this so-called Star Chamber of Lawyers from these 5 groups of Conservative MPs. They're deliberating on that. We'll learn their own verdict on the legal advice in the next 20 minutes or so. But on the other hand, we are now going to get this legal advice, or a summary of it, published by the government, which I suppose the argument will argue says makes this legislation work, makes it reduce the ability to appeal and all the rest of it. I suppose this is the fundamental feature of law. You get different interpretations, and there isn't always necessarily one easily arrivable at truth.
No, that's a very fair comment to say, and we've got about 30 minutes before potentially I look very silly and a bunch of people disagree with me. I've taken the line I have with a degree of confidence that I'm right, and we've just had a very apposite hearing because it's not connected to the Rwanda plan. But the government has been trying to set up what's called an immigration exemption to GDPR rules for a number of years. And it got the first attempt wrong, and then it went away and it drafted a second attempt. And the Court of Appeal has just confirmed that it got that wrong too. So no doubt when the government went to those hearings, the government had received advice, which the government may well publish in this instance, saying, oh, no, our legal advice is absolutely right, our analysis is correct. But they do get things wrong. And it's very important to focus on that because this is an emergency situation. And you'd think that there would be more collaboration than there has been. Instead of sort of asking for help or taking points on board or simply saying, oh, look, we've had these legal comments. Obviously, we'll review them. We'll think about them. We've had a very defensive line from the government. And that is inherently curious. I'm absolutely public. I have no position on this Rwanda plan at all. All I've done is highlight some major concerns with it, concerns within UK law, and the obvious concern. I mean, the concern is so obvious with the European Court of Human Rights that you would need to ask the government, well, why are you restricting their ability to issue an injunction if you're not worried about them? And if you're worried about their ability to issue an injunction, why are you not worried about their ability to do something after a trial at the final point? You're obviously going to be worried about them. And then the Prime Minister went and gave a speech saying, well, if they do something, I'll act then. So we'll act now.
I mean, Stephen, the key here, what we all want to know, is whether this legislation will end the merry-go-round, so-called, of legal challenges. Do you believe that it has hope that it can do that?
Not as drafted, no. Because
what needs to change, Stephen? Stephen, what needs to change?
They need to get rid of Section 4. Section 4 gives individuals the right to say, oh, actually, I know Rwanda's technically safe, but it's not safe for me. And then they can invent some complicated, convoluted reason why Rwanda is not safe for them. And that is a massive problem. That's what I call the death by 1,000 cuts problem. You think the ECHR would be a foreign court, effectively coming in as a bigger power and saying no. And this is just procedural. This will clog up the existing processes.
Stephen, what the government says to this, of course, is that it would only affect 0.5% of cases, i.e. 99.5% of appeals would be rejected on the grounds of this legislation. Is that a number you recognise?
No, and I think we're at the stage where we're just making up numbers, which is never particularly helpful in law. And we have been here on other issues where numbers are suddenly just plucked out of the air. Even if 99.5% of the appeals under Section 4 are rejected, you've still clogged up the system by having them. But it won't be. I think that's just a ludicrous figure. And it certainly doesn't reflect on our current acceptance rate. This country has a far higher acceptance rate than comparator countries in Western Europe. So we are obviously letting more things through that other countries do not let through. We are not rejecting people other countries would reject. So the idea that we're suddenly going to start rejecting 99.5%, I think that's just, I think it's not, it's an assertion that is very difficult to find any evidence for.
So, Stephen, you believe we're bound to see many, many legal challenges on the basis of this, Clause 4, which allows individuals to appeal if there is, in quotes, compelling evidence relating specifically to a person's individual circumstances. And you think that will open up plenty of legal challenges?
Yes, that's the death by 1,000 cuts one. Then we will see challenge, very likely see challenge in the European Court of Human Rights, possibly, potentially see challenge in the European Court of Justice, and potentially see major challenge to this because the drafting is not tight enough. I mean, I want to make it very clear that I'm in agreement with Lord Sumption and Lord Wolfson that ouster clauses work. But we've known since we started talking about ouster clauses that they have to be really well drafted.
It's interesting because Lord Sumption has said he believes that this bill would work, but you disagree there. You think that it might if it's tightened up. Would therefore the conclusion of that be committee stage, i.e. if the vote passes tomorrow, at committee stage there could be some amendments that actually make this bill, in your view, work?
Potentially, although committee won't deal with the European Court of Human Rights and it won't deal with the European Court of Justice. And it's a policy decision to get rid of Section 4 that they would need. I think that's beyond mere committee drafting.
Okay.
But if you like, I've identified 7 problems. 4 of them can be solved at committee stage. and 3 of them can't, and that's the problem.
It may be that we see some compromises and changes on this bill. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen Barrett, barrister and writer. Thank you for your time, Stephen. Always appreciate it. When we return, we will have more on Farage's exit from the jungle, and will he step back into frontline politics? First, though, the news with Townsend.
Thanks, Emily. Here are the headlines at 12:33. The Prime Minister has defended what he called a vigorous debate among senior government figures during the pandemic. He said it was appropriate when making such significant decisions. Earlier, Rishi Sunak began his evidence at the COVID inquiry with an apology to those who'd lost loved ones. However, he played down suggestions by Hugo Keith KC that severe inefficiencies in Downing Street had led to a chaotic style of governance.
Were you aware that his closest advisors had seemingly unanimously taken the view that there was a lack of efficiency? The administration is described privately as brutal and useless, or criminally incompetent, or operationally chaotic.
The fact that there was debate and that people were passionate about it and they had different points of view is I think, A, unsurprising, and B, good, because it would be worse if we were having this conversation and all the commentary was, well, there was no debate about any of this whatsoever. It was all just signed off straightforward. Someone put a piece of paper, someone checked, and that was the last we heard of it. I think that would actually be far worse, quite frankly. It's good that there was debate about these things.
The government is expected to publish legal advice on its plan to send migrants to Rwanda in what's seen as an attempt to curb dissent among Tory MPs. The unusual move comes as 5 groups of Tory backbenchers prepare to give their verdict on the controversial policy soon. MPs are expected to vote on the bill tomorrow. The United Nations is experiencing one of its worst funding shortfalls in years amid worsening global conflicts. Humanitarian crises were estimated to cost around $57 billion over the last 12 months. However, after receiving just a fraction of that amount, the UN is now lowering its expectation for the year ahead. Well, those are the headlines, and you can, of course, get more on all of those stories. Just visit our website, gbnews.com.
Stay with us here on Good Afternoon Britain. Next up, can the hospitality sector ever forgive the government for the economic damage they suffered during the pandemic?
We'll be speaking to one industry leader who has her doubts.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Acquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's
my new
It's
teeth.
your new
I
teeth.
know.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I think it's time for some views, don't you?
Absolutely.
Lots of you have been getting in touch about our main story, top story really of today, and that's the Rwanda plan. It's crunch time for this legislation, which is going to be voted on tomorrow. Caroline's written in. She says, as I keep saying in my emails to you, this government keeps making knee-jerk reactions and policies that possibly will not stand up in court. Who on earth is providing them with legal advice? You would think the cream of the crop legal teams work with the Prime Minister to ensure their policy ideas can actually be fulfilled. I mean, that's a good point, but as we were discussing before, interpretation of the law, that's what it's about.
I don't know, if they were spending millions and millions of pounds on the very best lawyers in the world, perhaps that would be a point of complaint as well. Alex has written in to say the Rwanda plan is just a distraction from the approximately 2 million visas the government has issued in the last 2 years. Well, Alex, I suppose the government would say to that, they've now got 2 migration ministers, one for illegal and one for legal migration too. That's a change from about last week.
Yes, it was in the papers also today that the number of student visas, international student visas, almost 800,000 last year, which apparently the Home Office was comfortable with. So there you go.
Well, Joan has written in to say our government/parliament don't have to do any Rwanda scheme. These people invaded our country illegally. They must be thrown out of our country and deported. Well, Joan, I think one of the issues is you need legal backing in order to deport people. And so that's why the government would argue that the legislation is required.
Yes.
And also you need somewhere to deport them to.
There's lots of human rights law that allows people to appeal deportation. Stuart says, why is no one highlighting the fact that if people are sent to Rwanda, the cost to us will not stop? We will have to pay for their every living need. Rwanda is not and never will be an answer to our immigration crisis. I wonder what proportion of the public are behind this policy now, after all of the obstacles, after all of the long wait that we've had.
Well, you know what? We've seen different polls saying different things. So often in polling, how you phrase the question can get completely different answers. One of my favourite examples of this is actually about the voting age. If you ask, should we enable 16 and 17, should we give 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote? There's a majority in favour. But if you say, should we lower the voting age to 16, you get a majority against. And it's entirely down to how you phrase the question sometimes.
Are you calling the great British public silly?
No, I'm saying that questions can be leading. There's that word, leading questions. It's very important to get neutral questions when you ask these sorts of things. And sometimes on Rwanda, you see what's known as push polling.
Yes, well, that's very interesting indeed. And just one nice one from David. He says he's really enjoying our show. He says it's his favourite. Well, keep watching and tell your friends and family.
And remember, write in yourself if you have views or thoughts on anything we're discussing. gbviews@gbnews.com is the address.
Yes, so the Prime Minister faces questioning today. The COVID inquiry rumbles on.
Starting off the inquiry with an apology to those who lost loved ones. The former Chancellor also allegedly called Dr. Death the Chancellor by some scientists, is being challenged over his much criticised Eat Out to Help Out scheme.
Yes, this came as the UK's hospitality industry was severely impacted by forced closures during the pandemic. Of course it was. Joining us is the Chief Executive of UK Hospitality, Kate Nichols. Kate, thank you very much for joining us. A lot of focus in the evidence session today on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Lots of people criticising it, saying it could have led to more COVID cases and potentially more lives lost. But it was a bit of a lifeline for many ailing businesses, was it not?
Absolutely right. I think you have to put yourself back into the time that we were in the pandemic. These businesses were impacted by lockdowns, but they also saw a drop-off in footfall ahead of lockdowns. So for hospitality in the UK, they started to see a loss of earnings from February ahead of the lockdown in March. And let's not forget, we had a week where the Prime Minister said, do not go to pubs and restaurants before we got into lockdown. So these businesses were closed for 5 months, unable to trade. When they reopened with such tough trading restrictions that they could only operate at about 50% capacity and therefore were operating at or below break even. So this scheme, together with the other support measures that the Chancellor put in place to make sure that the hospitality sector survived, was a vital shot in the arm. And let's not forget, the sector is the third largest private sector employer in the UK. 3.5 million people depended on the sector for their jobs and livelihood, and it generates large amounts of tax and revenue for the Exchequer. So really important that it got started again, and it's not unfair to say that without that scheme we would have seen many tens of thousands of businesses fail and millions of jobs lost.
Do you think, though, that this was the best use of potentially billions of pounds of taxpayer money? The money could have gone in a more targeted way. It didn't have to subsidise people's eating. Didn't we see that as soon as lockdowns ended, perhaps the year afterwards, people didn't need subsidies to go back out and go to fantastic restaurants, bars, pubs and all the rest of it? People really wanted to go to those things. Perhaps it was an unnecessary scheme.
I wouldn't suggest that it was unnecessary at all. I think, again, you have to put yourself back in the mindset of July 2020, August 2020, where we didn't know we were going to go back into 2 more lockdowns, tiers and restrictions. We didn't know we were going to have 2 years worth of COVID, where these businesses weren't trading. We were needing to get people back to being confident to go back out, not just into hospitality, but into the high street, into town centres. Retail also benefited. People were cautious, and even with the schemes in place, you still only saw half of all people come back out before we went into lockdown again in November. So it was needed to be able to get the economy restarted and to try and get growth going again. And it cost the Exchequer, it was anticipated to cost £500 million. It actually cost 800 million at the end of the scheme coming to an end. So it was a relatively small proportion of the 39 billion put in to keep the economy going through that period. And there is no clear evidence at all to suggest that those 12 days in August when the scheme was operating led to any increase in infections or cases being directly attributable to hospitality. As soon as you reopen the economy, cases will tick up, but there's no evidence that those 12 days led to any larger substantial increase.
Kate, it's sometimes hard to cast your mind back to that time with all the changing restrictions and all the different restrictions placed upon the hospitality industry. From your experience and from speaking to people within the sector, what was the most nonsensical / frustrating policy restriction at the time?
Well, there were many, but some of them you could understand why they were put in place. The most nonsensical one was that you could sit outside with a pork pie, you could drink, or a Scotch egg, you could drink, but you couldn't if you were not eating, and the substantial rule regulation was nonsensical. Also, the 9 o'clock curfew, the idea that if you closed everything down at 9 o'clock, you wouldn't have an impact on case numbers. Those two seem to have little evidence. At least the Eat Out to Help Out scheme had the merits of being economically beneficial.
Yeah, so it was an odd time when government policy advisors seemed to believe that COVID was nocturnal and only came out after 9 p.m.
And
a very curious time.
And failed to understand that if you closed something down at 9 o'clock, everybody would leave. Everybody would be trying to get on the tube.
Well, sorry, we're going to have to cut it short there, but thank you very much indeed, Kate Nichols, Chief Executive of UK Hospitality. Thank you for your time.
There were some bonkers rules.
Absolutely bonkers.
I mean, my local park put tape over the benches so you couldn't sit down on a bench.
And on those little outdoor workout centres, you know, as if, you know, a bit of exercise isn't what we all need. Anyway.
Do you know what I think? It shouldn't have been eat out to help out. It should have been eat outside to help out.
Well, there you
Rishi
go.
Sunak advocated this policy, walking through indoor... Like, we knew that it was a airborne virus by this point. If we'd have just encouraged people to go to their favourite pubs and restaurants and everything else, but eat outside, probably would have been much better.
I remember shivering in a park with a takeaway pint once, you know, good times.
Right.
Anyway.
In the winter, we made people sit outside in the cold, and in the blazing hot summer, we said, oh, go inside.
Yeah, you know, we could have got on well that way. Anyway, it wasn't quite the outcome many had hoped for. Nigel Farage has ended his time in the jungle in 3rd place after making the final of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. I think he did pretty well.
He reached the heady heights of Matt Hancock.
He did.
Well, after coming 3rd, here's what Nigel had to say to Eamon and Isabel on breakfast this morning.
I'm already beginning to miss the sounds of the jungle. The crickets, the kookaburra, the cuckoos, the owls, the howls of creatures we've never heard from. I mean, to be honest, I spent 23 nights in there, and I loved every single minute of it. It's been the most unbelievable experience, and I would not for one moment say that I regret a single moment of it. Great to be out, but I really had a fantastic time.
We spoke to Biggins a few moments ago, who said for politicians it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to win. So coming 3rd is probably the best any politician really could hope for. Do you feel disappointed, or do you feel like 3rd is actually, you know, quite an achievement?
Do you know what? I mean, look, if you'd said to me before this started that I'd make the final, I'd go for the final bush tucker trial, I'd be buried underground with 20 snakes all over me, that I come out with I hope some degree of dignity, and come 3rd, I'd have bitten your arm off. So I'm delighted with the way that it turned out, thrilled that I got through to the last round, and I was the outsider. The other 11 people that went in there were either professional sportsmen or people from pop music or popular culture. I was the only one from the other side of the line that came from politics and current affairs. I think to get through and come 3rd, I think for me it's been a real achievement. I'm thrilled with it, delighted, and want to thank everybody, particularly GB News, who I know and I've learnt now, backed me all the way. Thank you. Everybody that supported me, that voted for me, I'm very, very grateful, very flattered and very honoured.
Well, how are you going to consolidate that goodwill and turn it into votes?
Oh, Eamon, you never give up, do you? The first thing I'm going to do is go out for dinner, because I'm starving.
Have you lost
We've
weight?
been living on rice and beans for a couple of weeks, so I'm going to go out for dinner. As for where life goes from here, I don't know. I mean, I've almost for a month been away from the news. From what I can see, the so-called Conservative government, I say so-called because they're not in the least bit Conservative, are in a state of total shambles, rudderless, leaderless, utterly useless, headed for catastrophe at the next election, deservedly so. That's not to say Labour will be any more competent, but somehow to think that I'm going to walk out of a jungle after 23 nights and announce a relaunch in British politics, frankly, is for the birds.
A lot has happened whilst you've been in there. Suella Braverman's been sacked. Your old nemesis, Lord Cameron, has come into the fold. Lord now, Foreign Secretary. We've also had net migration at 750,000. So much for you to digest there. But all the chatter, and I'm getting the impression from what you've just said is nonsense, but all the chatter is that you and Boris could create some sort of pact to restore the chances of the Conservatives. Now, you and I have spoken about this in the past, and you felt quite wronged by Boris in the past, that he reneged on a deal with you. Does that mean it's never going to happen again?
never say never. Never say never. I can't predict right now what will happen. What I do think is that our country is being appallingly led, that there is no proper opposition party, and that we're living through a population crisis. And that really has little to do with the small boats, offensive though that is. It's due to the fact that over 17 million people voted for lower immigration, voted for more border controls. What they've got is a Conservative Party in hock to giant multinational businesses who want as much foreign labour as they possibly can. And if you want a GP appointment, you want to get a house for your kids, you want to drive anywhere without being stuck in on a terrible traffic jam, you can frankly go to hell.
I love how Nigel says, never say never when he's asked about his political ambitions.
Keep your powder dry. It's always the way to go, isn't it?
Well, yeah, exactly. Keep us on tender hooks.
Yes,
there you go.
But no, it's fascinating. Bill has written in to say, well done, Nigel, in the jungle. You're a star, but whatever you do, do not join the Conservatives, saying that they're surrounded by enemies, brackets, Remainers. I thought, are we not beyond the Remainer-Leaver dichotomy yet?
Well, I've had a little look in the inbox, and there are lots of you saying that's the last thing he should do is join the Conservatives. But as Nigel said, never say never. Who knows what's coming next?
Well, I know what's coming up next on this programme. Coming up in the next hour, right-wing Tory MPs have delivered their verdict on the government's emergency Rwanda legislation. We'll bring you that live from Westminster after this.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Afternoon, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. After a fine Monday for most of us, we're back to some heavy downpours tomorrow and some gusty winds also starting to head into Northern Ireland through this evening. Ahead of that, we've had a few showers today over eastern Scotland. They'll keep going, but for many it's a fine evening. Here comes the rain, though. Could cause some problems in Northern Ireland as it lingers for most of the night. Potential for a bit of flooding, so we do have a Met Office yellow warning in place. The rain will move through across England, Wales and into southern Scotland. A mild night tonight in the south, but pretty chilly across northern Scotland. Touch of frost just about possible. That rain will then spread into parts of southeast Scotland, northeast England tomorrow, where again likely to linger, and because it's been so wet it could cause some further issues. In the south, heavy showers likely tomorrow. Potential for some thunderstorms, even hailstones likely. For many, it's a cloudy day with rain on and off, some drier and brighter spells. Quite mild in the south, double digits, maybe even into the teens, but chilly again further north. Touch of frost on Wednesday morning across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Further outbreaks of rain, but not as heavy across these eastern areas during Wednesday. So quite a grey day for eastern England, but elsewhere it's actually turning drier and brighter through the course of Wednesday. This weather front will bring a bit of rain in on Wednesday night, but look at this, high pressure moving in from midweek onwards, and that should start to dry things out.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Ah!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It is Monday, the 11th of December. Still to come.
Rwanda crunch time. It's a race against time for the Prime Minister as more and more of his own MPs look set to reject or at least abstain on the Rwanda bill tomorrow. We'll have the very latest on which names have joined this burgeoning Tory revolt.
Has Rishi Sunak thrown his old boss under the bus? The Prime Minister said he is deeply sorry to all of those who lost loved ones during the pandemic. The former Chancellor says whilst facing a grilling at the COVID inquiry today. We'll bring you the latest.
And what's next for Nige? Well, after taking the bronze in the jungle, GB News' very own Nigel Farage hints at a return to frontline politics, launching scathing attacks on both the leadership of the Tories and the Labour Party. Could he launch a third comeback?
And while Rishi Sunak is, of course, at the COVID inquiry, being asked all sorts of questions about his time as Chancellor and the role he played during the pandemic, this revolt is brewing. And one of the things he's going to do, according to our political editor, is launch a smoked salmon charm offensive.
That's right. Tomorrow morning, apparently, Number 10 will be trying to butter up, well, not just the blinis with the smoked salmon on them, but the MPs that they're given to, and perhaps water down any revolt. The big question will be what is decided about when the revolt plays out. Will they try and keep their powder dry and go for putting amendments in a later stage of the bill's passage through Parliament, the report stage, or will they vote against it tomorrow? We'll be speaking to our political editor imminently on what these 5 groups of Tory MPs have said in a meeting that broke up just a couple of minutes ago.
But first, let's get the headlines.
Thanks very much, Emily. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 2 minutes past 1. The Prime Minister has defended what he called vigorous debate among senior government figures during the pandemic. He said it was appropriate when making such significant decisions. Earlier, Rishi Sunak began his evidence at the COVID inquiry with an apology to those who'd lost loved ones. However, he played down suggestions by Hugo Keith KC that severe inefficiencies in Downing Street had led to a chaotic style of governance.
Were you aware that his closest advisers had seemingly unanimously taken the view that there was a lack of efficiency? The administration is described privately as brutal and useless, or criminally incompetent, or operationally chaotic.
The fact that there was debate and that people were passionate about it and they had different points of view is I think, A, unsurprising, and B, good, because it would be worse if we were having this conversation and all the commentary was, well, there was no debate about any of this whatsoever. It was all just signed off straightforward. Someone put a piece of paper, someone checked, and that was the last we heard of it. I think that would actually be far worse, quite frankly. It's good that there was debate about these things.
Well, the Prime Minister also blamed government borrowing during lockdown for record high taxes. He told the inquiry that the impact of having to pay it back only comes after everyone forgets why it was necessary. It comes as new data shows property taxes are among the highest across the developed world, with the Office for Budget Responsibility signalling further hikes to come. Some breaking news now. The government's Rwanda legislation provides a partial and incomplete solution. That's according to the so-called Star Chamber of Lawyers. The Tory MP's team of advisers says the plan may be the toughest laws yet, but it doesn't go far enough to achieve the Prime Minister's stated aim of stopping the boats. The bill heads for a crunch vote tomorrow in what's set to be an important week for the Prime Minister. Gary Lineker is among several high-profile personalities who've signed a letter describing the policy as uncaring, chaotic and costly. Defence Secretary Grant Shapps says he should stick to football.
What is moral about allowing criminal gangs to put people's lives at risk for large sums of money by trafficking them across the English Channel? What on earth has got into anyone's minds to think that we shouldn't challenge or tackle that disgusting trade in human misery? And so, again, unless he, Labour or anyone else have got a better plan, at least we're putting plans in place which are starting to have success, slashed by a third, and would do more in the future.
Parents and teachers say the regulation of schools should be more transparent and less high stakes, according to a new report. It found that 42% of parents support more transparency in how Ofsted judges schools, with respondents also in favour of more frequent inspections. The report by policy consultancy Public First comes after a coroner found that an Ofsted inspection likely contributed to the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. The United Nations is experiencing one of its worst funding shortfalls in years, after just over a third of its required aid budget was provided last year. Humanitarian crises were estimated to cost around $57 billion over the last 12 months as conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine worsened. However, after receiving just a fraction of that amount, the UN is now lowering its expectation for the year ahead, with today's appeal for $46 billion. Aid chief says it's difficult to decrease aid budgets amid intensifying global conflicts while staying realistic about what's needed. Dengue fever could become a national domestic disease in England by 2060 because of climate change. Government health experts say warmer conditions are to blame for the spread of the Asian tiger mosquito, known for its potential spread of the disease. The UK Health Security Agency warns the mosquito could become commonplace across England over the next 2 to 3 decades. Officials say warmer weather brings a higher risk of disease and pandemics. Now, if you're driving home for Christmas, experts say you'd better plan ahead. With Christmas falling on a Monday this year, the AA predicts Friday the 22nd and Saturday the 23rd to be the busiest days for traffic. Around 16.1 million car journeys are expected to take place across the UK during the festive weekend. That's all from me for now. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker. Just say, play GB News. Now, back to Tom and Emily.
So, while the Prime Minister is giving evidence at the COVID inquiry, his party are making their decision over this controversial Rwanda plan.
Yes, Rishi Sunak faces a crunch vote in Parliament tomorrow when both the left and the right wings of his party have threatened to derail that vote. But many of their decisions are being made today.
There's only one man we can go to, our political editor, Christopher Hope, who is in Westminster. Christopher, can you bring us the latest on this? I understand you have some breaking news for us.
Well, yeah, the latest news is this. This is the summary pages of this European Research Group of Tory MPs Legal Advisory Committee known as the Star Chamber. That's 5 different groups of Tory MPs on the right. They are saying very clearly this Rwanda bill provides a partial and incomplete solution to the problems of legal challenges to the UK. What they're saying here, essentially, is what's happened before over the past 18 months since they unveiled this Rwanda plan will carry on again. More lawyers will be able to challenge and stop anyone being taken from this country to Rwanda for processing if they arrive here illegally in small boats. Nothing will change, is what they're saying. The challenge overnight now to the PM is to say quite clearly, change it, harden it up overnight, and we'll support it. More likely is they're going to abstain on it. The government will find it hard to win. It won't be clear they're winning until the very last moment tomorrow and come back in the new year to try and amend it. But Rishi Sunak's day at the COVID inquiry, if he's watching this now, will know it's got a lot worse.
Now, Chris, it is important, this distinction between voting against and abstaining. The government could withstand perhaps more than 50 MPs abstaining on this legislation, but it would only take, around 25 for them to lose their majority if they voted against it. But the abstentions matter in terms of how the Lords then responds.
That's right, the magic number is 28. If more than 28 Tory MPs vote against, the bill falls at the first hurdle, and then there's a complete chaos in the government, frankly. On abstentions, it's basically if you remove yourself from supporting, it's more like 56, 57 required to abstain. But we are in that ballpark because 100 or so on the right of the party, 100 or so on the left of the party meet tonight. You only need a quarter of those numbers to inflict a defeat by not supporting the government. So, yeah, a big deal. Even if the government squeaks through low tens tomorrow night when it's voted on in the House of Commons, that's also bad for the government because they need a big support at the second reading stage to force the Lords to let it go without amending it heavily. If it's seen to be contested in the Commons, the Lords will use that and allow themselves to try and amend it, change it, water it down, further threatening the prospect of this bill either working or even allowing planes to take off in May, as the PM has said. It's getting worse for the PM as the day goes on, not better. Tomorrow morning, though, he'll be back charming MPs. We understand that, reported today, he'll be having breakfast meetings with Tory MPs. I think you mentioned smoked salmon. It might be cold bacon and eggs, Emily, more than smoked salmon, but it might be a nice way to start the day.
It might be. Christopher, just lastly, these right-wing Tory MPs want this bill to be toughened up. What might that look like? What does toughening up mean?
Well, I'm trying to go through the details in the report in my hand. They're concerned that there's only limited disapplication of the Human Rights Act. It may be to require the more of a kind of broad brush blanket removal of these human rights elements to legal challenges to make sure it works. Because the problem is, if you have a migrant arriving can make particular cases to say maybe I might have PTSD if I go back to Rwanda or other reasons, that can be enough to stop it. So lawyers will take each case individually, find a single reason to ensure that the HRA Human Rights Act can apply in those cases, and it will see it thrown out. So I think they want a more of a broad brush approach from the government to make it work. But don't forget, the PM, Mr Sunak, told us in that press conference last Thursday that he's gone as far as he can, and any further risk collapsing the whole treaty. He knows he's walking a very fine line, and the left won't be happy if it goes further. It becomes more hardline overnight. So it's a very, very difficult place right now for the PM.
And Chris, just to stick with you for a moment, raising those MPs on the left of the party, those groups that are meeting tonight, is the risk that if Rishi Sunak makes concessions to the ERG types, those One Nation Tory MPs are more likely to rebel themselves?
Or not even rebel, Tom, abstain. I mean, you only need 25 or so from the One Nation group, 25, 30 or so from the red right-wing lot for the government to be defeated, because you remove 60 or so Tory MPs, the majority is lost for the government. So you're absolutely right. I mean, that's why it's a very, very difficult position to be in. It felt very much like the Brexit wars that you and I covered back in the day outside this Grimmond room in the house, in the portcullis house just now. All the hacks, all the journalists squeezed in there trying to grab bits of paper, run around with them and ask them questions. I mean, it did feel like a degree of chaos. You do forget sometimes this government has got a majority, a working majority, well over 50. It does feel quite existential, frankly.
Very, very difficult balancing act for Rishi Sunak. And of course, he is at the COVID inquiry as we speak. Thank you very much indeed, Christopher Hope, political editor for us from Westminster.
Well, mentioning that COVID inquiry in a wonderful segue, that, of course, is continuing with the Prime Minister taking the hot seat. Formerly, of course, the Chancellor at the time, Rishi Sunak, has been giving evidence throughout the morning. And here's what he had to say about the government's implementation of advice from stage. And this is interesting, because Rishi Sunak really blasted through a narrative that has started to set hold. I think that this is really compelling evidence. Let's have a listen.
You know, my strong recollection of those few weeks in March was that advice was put to the government, to the Prime Minister from Sage, and advice was followed pretty much imminently on the same day in most cases, if not all cases, during that period. The advice changed from Sage during that period, but the government, when the advice changed, the government acted. The Prime Minister didn't say, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to change. We were sitting there, we got the advice about when we should implement self-isolation, household isolation, originally not to close schools, not to ban mass events. Things changed, particularly on the 16th of March. That's when the advice from Sage changed considerably about the speed of implementation. But again, Prime Minister reacted. Schools were closed on, I think, that was announced on the 18th, because that was put before the committee at the time. And again, that was just acted on immediately, I think the same day, both on the 16th and the 18th. I think the Prime Minister stood up the same day and announced those decisions. And again, even up to about, I think, the 19th of March, the view from Sage, the view from the Chief Medical Officer was that the existing measures that had been announced, if there was, in their words, 75% compliance, they should do the trick.
Well, there you go. Rishi Sunak setting out how, yes, the government has been accused of wobbling all over the place on what rules it implemented, but actually looking at the advice coming from the scientists, that's what was changing. And he's right. I've got before me some Sage minutes from the 13th of March 2020, well into that period of COVID, where they say Sage was unanimous. This is a direct quote. Sage was unanimous that measures seeking to completely suppress the spread of COVID-19 will cause a second peak. It then goes on to criticise countries that have done so-called heavy suppression, what we now know as lockdown measures. So as late as the 13th of March, the official scientific advice was don't do what was later to be known as a lockdown. And this is forgotten. There's this foundational myth that the scientists are all saying lockdown, the politicians were trying to push against that, and that's not the case at all. That's really not the case.
But ultimately, the politicians made the decision. So let's speak to Ray Addison, who is live for us now, to give us the latest on the inquiry. Tom has picked out that moment where Rishi Sunak said the government was given this different advice, and when the advice changed initially, they changed the policy. Ray, what have you got for us?
Yeah, Rishi Sunak's been very clear that throughout the whole process of the pandemic, the decisions were made which very much followed the advice of the scientists. Of course, I might point out to you that just behind me, various COVID campaigners have been calling for politicians to face consequences for misconduct in public office. They believe that the pandemic was handled very badly. Rishi Sunak very keen to point out that they were following that advice. advice. Of course, one of those key areas that is being focused on is the process of decision-making and whether there was any dysfunction in that process within Downing Street. Now, Rishi Sunak earlier on was absolutely clear that he denied that Boris Johnson was easily swayed in decision-making. Now, that might be because it's been suggested, and Rishi Sunak has acknowledged, that he did have bilateral meetings with the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the time. Bilateral as in the two of them on their own. Sometimes this would just be informally in the garden because they happen to share the garden space behind Downing Street. And so he had an opportunity to really give his views. It was also pointed out that between meetings and after meetings, sometimes there would be one perception of a particular direction in which the government was going to travel. However, then Rishi would then speak to Mr. Johnson, and then perhaps those decisions would later change. Mr. Sunak very clear to say that the cabinet was not sidelined by the PM. He would have had a number of bilateral meetings with other ministers as well. It wasn't just him, he's saying, and so there was a range of views, and it wasn't just normally that decisions would be made after one meeting. There would be a series of meetings. That was how Mr. Johnson liked to come to those decisions. He'd have a series of meetings and then make his final decision. Now, within the last hour or so, Mr. Sunak has been asked about the impact of this so-called fear narrative, as he has put it in the past, on the public. He admitted that he was concerned by the pace of that narrative and on how it affected the public's return to normal life and how that would then therefore affect the economy, particularly, he says, hospitality, leisure, tourism and retail. Why? Because in Mr. Sunak's words, these are sectors that often employ some of our most vulnerable in society. He said at the time there was polling which suggested that there was great reticence in the UK for the public to properly return to normal life. And he wrote a note at the time saying that unless the UK was reopened at a faster speed, we risked being placed at a competitive disadvantage. However, it was then pointed out by the KC that the government scientific advisors did warn that the reopening schedule planned by the government was at the riskier end of the spectrum. So these are all topics that have been discussed so far. We haven't had a key focus on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. I feel that's coming towards the end of the day.
Saving that till last, perhaps. Thank you very much, Ray Addison, outside the COVID inquiry, our reporter there. He'll be keeping his ear very much open to find out all the best bits.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, though, isn't it, to have an assessment when you're hearing from all of these different people. They all have different, assumptions on what was and what wasn't happening.
But clearly it was an incredibly difficult period and no one knew how initially to respond. Measures that we eventually ended up doing were measures never taken before in the history of this country. I think to some extent you've got to give a bit of slack to people that had no idea, scientists, politicians, industry leaders, everyone else, how to respond. And as Rishi Sunak said this morning, up until the 19th of March, that's almost the end of March, scientists were still saying voluntary measures, if three-quarters of people follow these measures, then we'll be fine. And they only changed their minds after that point. And that was the scientists, not the politicians.
And this is where we disagree, because I wish they'd remained voluntary. But there we go. Coming up, we'll be finding out why Northern Ireland is hosting talks with political leaders today. Stay with us.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Now the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, is hosting fresh talks in Northern Ireland today, talking to political leaders as he seeks to get the executive there back in motion.
Yes, joining us now from Hillsborough Castle is our Northern Ireland reporter, Doogie Beattie. Doogie, bring us the latest, please.
Well, he says it's about trying to get the Northern Ireland Assembly up and running again, and I suppose in a roundabout way he probably is. But it's more about finance, and finance has been a real problem here in Northern Ireland. If you go back to about 2010, Wales had said that the Barnett formulas weren't addressing need rather than a head count, and they ran a thing alongside the Barnett consequentials called the Holtham formula, which basically puts a floor, a fiscal floor in place to make sure that public sector is paid and paid at a good wage, etc. And that's exactly what's happening behind us here. As politicians are gathering, the unions here are striking. So Northern Ireland is about 300 million underfunded now, and if that continues on to 2025, that will look at about 1.2 billion. So this morning the Secretary of State has met with the head of the civil service in Northern Ireland, and just about now the politicians are arriving to go in there and have a chat with them, and he is going to try and address this as a new financial package of some sort. But of course it's not. It's what they've been arguing for the last 13 years or so, that they can have that headroom, if you like, financial headroom, in order to address the problems with pay in the public sector. So this morning he came out, he spoke for about 20 seconds, wouldn't take questions, and disappeared off again. And that was probably because some of us had realised that this is exactly what this is about. There's no doubt that they will try and push the DUP and unionists back into government, but what's happening inside the Rwanda deal is going to affect Northern Ireland in a big way, because of course Northern Ireland has no borders with the EU. There is no border on the island of Ireland between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and immigrants that come into the south of Ireland will just travel across a borderless border straight into the UK. And as I said to you, Tom, this time last year, that it will eventually get to the point where you will have the ridiculous situation where British citizens will have to show British passports to get back into Britain. Otherwise, you're closing the front door into Britain and leaving the back door wide open. So all these things have to be addressed. As well as that, there's also the issues around Northern Ireland manufacturers here. They're still having to manufacture to EU specifications, even though 70% of our market is with the UK, and that will, well, it'll give a financial hook, I suppose, on those companies in the UK and very much disadvantage those inside Northern Ireland. So those are all things that are going on in the main talks at this minute in time, and it has to be said they have got very close, but at this minute in time they have stalled, and there seems to be no way forward because the government, I think, are very much focused on what is happening with the Rwanda deal.
Goodness me, stalled talks around Northern Ireland politics. It's a toss over us, I suppose, to some extent. Just Doogie, quickly, there's a big group of protesters, it seems, behind you. What's their grievance?
Well, these are all health workers, teachers, etc., that have been on strike through Northern Ireland, as they have across the rest of the UK. But some of the health workers here, wages, they are not linked with those in the mainland UK, and they are paid substantially less in some cases than their counterparts in the rest of the UK. And that is because we're going back to this very much this fiscal seal, or this fiscal floor that must be brought into place. And even if the Assembly was up and running tomorrow, they would have no money to pay these people because, of course, it goes back to the Barnett consequentials and the whole thumb formulas that are there that is based on need rather than a head count of where we are.
Goodness me, well, I think it's the first time that we've seen people arguing for the wages that nurses are paid in England, Scotland and Wales. After all, a lot of nurses' unions have been quite upset by that, but clearly even more of an issue in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much indeed, Doogie Beattie, our Northern Ireland reporter there outside Hillsborough Castle. And we're going to be looking ahead, of course, we're still looking ahead, of course, to that vote tomorrow on this emergency Rwanda legislation. Things are heating up.
Yes, and a press conference to be held very, very shortly by the representatives of those 5 groups, mainly the ERG, but also, as we've been hearing, the New Conservatives, the Conservative Growth Group, many other groups as well, representing 100 Tory MPs. They haven't yet decided how to vote.
Yes, they want the bill to be toughened up, hardened up, in their words. I believe that's what Christopher Hope was saying.
Yes, but in terms of how they do that by trying to vote down the bill and then bring it back later? Or do they sort of abstain, hope it goes through and amend it at committee stage? But if they do that and it doesn't pass with a big majority, does the House of Lords then say, look, there's no mandate for this bill, even your MPs, even many of your MPs don't want it, we're going to block it now? That's the real risk.
Now, Tom, you've been a political reporter for quite a while now.
Yeah.
What is your verdict, or what do you think's going to happen? Do you think this bill will get through in some kind of watered down way, or do you think it will be toughened up?
I think it will pass as written tomorrow. That's my prediction, and I might be setting myself up for a big fool here because, of course, a lot can change tonight.
Yeah.
We're going to be hearing a meeting at 6 p.m. this evening now in terms of how these right-wing Conservatives will decide to vote, but also the One Nation left-wing group of Conservative MPs meeting tonight. So things could shift in the next 12 hours fairly substantially. But I think my central prediction now is this bill will pass, but then the government itself will sponsor amendments and toughen things up a bit later down the track.
Well, because there is this issue that Rwanda might be the ones to pull out of this treaty.
Well, they're worried that if we disapply too many elements of international law, they'll look bad on the international stage. And so they're saying, well, this is as far as we can go. But I mean, we were just talking a second ago that £800 million was spent on Eat Out to Help Out over 12 days in the August of 2020. We've spent 200-odd million on Rwanda so far, so that's only a quarter of Eat Out to Help Out.
Yes, but it's reportedly going to cost a lot more than that over the years, but that depends on what shape it is.
Money can sort of grease the wheels of these things, I think.
Well, we'll bring you the very latest updates on that story and continue to discuss it with our wonderful panel, who will be joining us very soon indeed. But let's get the news with Tamsin first.
Thanks, Emily. Here are the headlines at 1:31. The government's Rwanda legislation provides a partial and incomplete solution, according to the so-called Star Chamber of Lawyers. A legal team for the group of Tory MPs says the plan may be the toughest action yet, but it doesn't go far enough to achieve the Prime Minister's stated aim of stopping the boats. The bill heads for a crunch vote tomorrow in what's said to be an important week for the Prime Minister. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak has defended what he called a vigorous debate among senior government figures during the pandemic. He said it was appropriate when making such significant decisions. Earlier, the Prime Minister began his evidence at the COVID inquiry with an apology to those who'd lost loved ones. Speaking in the last hour, family members of some of those who died said his words don't go far enough.
Today, what the Prime Minister should now take credit for was releasing a new wave of death and disease. Rishi Sunak's one-man mission to torpedo lockdown to gain a competitive advantage resulted in the false economy of sacrificing tens of thousands of lives to save the economy. Today, the COVID bereaved do not accept his empty words of sorrow, and it is of note that the Prime Minister has failed to utter one word of apology.
Well, the Prime Minister has also blamed government borrowing during lockdown for record high taxes. He told the inquiry the economic impact of paying it back is only now being felt by taxpayers. It comes as new data shows property taxes are among the highest across the developed world, with the Office for Budget Responsibility signalling further hikes to come. Those are the headlines. You can, of course, get more on all of those stories. Just visit our website, gbnews.com.
Right, well, let's have a look at what's in the GB Views. I think we've got a couple right here on the Rwanda scheme. Steve says even if the ECHR is removed from the illegal immigration approach, the lefty lawyers will then start using the Equality Act. Well, there you go.
Goodness, it's a view. Paul says, let's hope they vote against it. Stop wasting taxpayers' money. But, Paul, I suppose the argument is, without anywhere to deport people to, they're stuck in hotels in the UK.
Yes.
And that's more expensive.
Yes, more expensive. And we've heard that it's going to be potentially hundreds and hundreds of millions in just a few years that's going to be spent on this particular crisis that the government is facing, well, the country's facing.
But, Emily, I hear that it's all going to be solved.
Oh, how?
Because there's been an intervention from a significant cultural figure.
Who could that be?
That's right. Gary Lineker has weighed in. Surprise, surprise, Gary Lineker has weighed into this debate. We'll be talking about just how much influence the football pundit has on British politics after this.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Has the Rwanda conundrum been solved after a big thinker weighed in on the debate? That's right, Gary Lineker has written a letter, so clearly we can all pack up now and go home. Let's discuss his intervention now and some of the other big stories of the day with the former editor of the Sunday Express, Martin Townsend, and the former Labour MP, Simon Danczuk.
The great intellect, Gary Lineker, has waded in once again. Simon, what do you make of this?
Well, I think he should stay out of it, to be quite honest.
Why?
Well, I know very little about football. I know a lot about politics and doing government and policy. He knows very little about government and doing policy. He should stick to football. The reality is that I actually think it's uncaring and unchristian to support the people traffickers bringing people over here, actually. And that's where he's placing himself. I think he's got it completely wrong. It's unchristian, uncaring to support the people traffickers who are actually drowning people in the Channel. That's the reality of it.
And Martin, we've been talking about the legal migration to this country for a couple of weeks now, in great detail, a significant proportion of which includes hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, Hong Kongers, Afghans, all of these groups that we've taken in as legal refugees. I find it very hard to understand how anyone could say that this is an uncaring policy. The numbers that we've taken in have been significant.
I don't think it's an uncaring policy. I think it's a terrible policy, if I'm honest, because I think it's completely impractical. I don't think it's ever going to work. Even if we actually got to the stage where we were sending people to Rwanda, I can see endless problems in Rwanda itself. I can see it being a field day for newspapers that will be out there talking to every single immigrant that person that they can find about conditions within the centre, etc., etc. Rwanda's got a dreadful record on looking after people like that anyway at the home. I just see it as a totally impracticable and unworkable system. That's my objection to it. And actually picking up on a point Simon just made there, what I don't understand is if we can bust these huge drug gangs in Europe through collaboration across Europe, the police forces, etc., why on earth can't we crack the traffickers?
I do disagree with you there, Martin. I think the Rwanda policy is the right one. I think it discourages people from paying all the money to people traffickers to come over here because they know if they land here, they could well end up in Rwanda. I know Rwanda very well. I have a home there. My wife is Rwandan. It's a very safe country. The United Nations uses Rwanda to send refugees and asylum seekers there already. It's got a very good reputation. It's exceptionally safe. I think it's a good policy, and the sooner the government get it implemented, the better.
So, Martin, you're on Team Gary Lineker.
I'm not on Team Gary Lineker at all, and I think Lineker's completely wrong to have spoken out on this issue because he works for the BBC and he's paid very well and he should be completely unbiased in my view. I think it's a misuse of his position. I completely disagree with him being able to speak out. I'm speaking out on practicalities. I think the Tories have made a huge mistake nailing pretty much their kind of election promise, if you like, to this particular mast. They're never going to get this through legally over the next however many weeks and months. It's just not going to happen. In the meantime, we've got a cost of living crisis going on. We've got all kinds of other problems going on in the world. And we've got a Labour Party that doesn't have any ideas or any policies. They should be attacking the Labour Party. They should be trying to get across the fact that Rishi Sunak has done quite a lot in terms of stabilising the economy, trying to get things back on track. He's done some good work there. A lot of this is now being undone by what people see as this endless legal argument over Rwanda.
But isn't one of the major problems too, Simon, that there seems to be no united front when it comes to the Conservative government? If all of the Tory MPs were behind this policy and were desperate to make it work and prove, the naysayers wrong, perhaps it would stand a greater chance of success.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. I think the Conservative MPs are in disarray, and I was just reading...
Simon, I'm sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you. We're going to go live to the ERG, who are speaking in Westminster, on their votes tomorrow.
Again, to reiterate the bottom line conclusion of the Star Chamber's report, this is taken from the report, and that report is now available for anyone in this country to read via the Lawyers for Britain website. The summary was, I quote, "The bill provides a partial and incomplete solution to the problem of legal challenges in the UK courts being used as stratagems to delay or defeat the removal of illegal migrants to Rwanda." I'll just add, the Common Sense Group are hosting a further meeting at 6 p.m. this evening, which is also going to be addressed by Robert Jenrick. So if you like, they've come to us, and at 6%, we're all going over to theirs, if I can put it like that. So that's where things currently sit. Who would like to ask the first question? Well, we discussed this for about, a good hour and a half, Beth, and I'm not sure that final decisions will be taken even today because of the importance of the issue. But one thing that most of the members of that meeting I chaired were clear about was coming back to the bill overall provides a partial and incomplete solution. The feeling very much in the meeting is that the government will be best advised to pull the bill and to come up with a revised version that works better than this one, which has so many holes in it. In as much as there was a consensus, Beth, that was the consensus. Right. I'll ask David in a moment to comment on that as well. What the Star Chamber have done in great detail is lay out... Sorry, just pausing for the Whip's office there. That they've laid out in great detail where they believe the weaknesses are. It might be better to start again with a fresh bill that is written on a different basis. But David's a member of the Star Chamber.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think that the bill is easily amendable. And really, I think that the government needs to review it and maybe consider a completely new piece of legislation, because this leaves so many gaps in the legislation and so many ways that people could actually evade the legislation if they wanted to remain in this country.
Okay, please. If I were you, I wouldn't assume anything until at least there's been a further meeting at 6 p.m. this evening.
Well, that's the logical assumption, isn't it?
Well, we've, if you like, drop the government a broad hint. We'll see how the government reply. Now, sorry, Beth, who hasn't had a go?
The government say they've already got as far as the candidates in the Red Party program. Is it really in the country's interest or in your party's interest coming out in the media and
Well, we all want to stop the boats. There have been 2 legislative attempts at this already. The Nationalities and Borders Act, that didn't quite work. The Illegal Immigration Act, that didn't quite work. So this is kind of 3 strikes and you're out, isn't it? So what is really important is if we're going to put a bill through Parliament, to have a piece of legislation which is fit for purpose. As the bill is currently drafted, it isn't. Beth, do you want the last words? Beth, you're good at your job, but I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. Let's, for the moment, just focus on the legislation. I think, Beth, you can ask the Prime Minister that one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I'd say there'll be a further meeting at 6 p.m. this evening. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, there we have it. The chairman of the European Research Group of Conservative MPs, Mark Francois, accompanied by the deputy chairman, David Jones, giving their verdict. The result of that meeting that took place at midday today, saying that, in their view, the bill in its current form is not fit for purpose, adding that the government would be best advised to pull the legislation, rework it, and then reintroduce it at a later date. However, they also added that MPs have not decided in this meeting which way they will vote tomorrow. There will be a further meeting at 6 p.m, and Mark Francois said some MPs in the groups that were represented by that meeting earlier today, some of those MPs will not decide until tomorrow. So a long process still. Let's join now one MP whose vote, of course, will be crucial, as all Conservative MPs' votes will be. Paul Bristow is the Conservative MP for Peterborough. And Paul, listening there to what Mark Francois said, having digested the Star Chamber's analysis, have you made up your mind how you'll be voting?
Well, hello, Tom. Well, look, I'm still waiting for reassurances from the government. I'm hoping that they will strengthen this bill further. It's clear what this bill does. It takes us beyond the objections, perhaps, of the Supreme Court, the reasons it was rejected earlier. But we know what these lawyers are like. They'll use the elasticity of the human rights legislation to find any way to try and frustrate our efforts to ensure that this government, the elected British government, have the power to determine who comes to this country and in what circumstances. And the flagship policy for that is, of course, Rwanda. They will frustrate this at every turn, and that's why we need a watertight bill to ensure that it's this government who decides our immigration policy.
Paul, for the British public watching this all go on, it's rather tiresome watching Conservative MPs and the infighting. Would it not be better for Conservative MPs to stand behind this policy, stand behind this bill and have a united front? This constant briefing of different Tory MPs' views on this legislation can be tiresome for many people.
Well, I stand 100% behind the Prime Minister and his plan and pledge to stop the boats. That's why we've got to make this legislation as watertight as possible. Let's just understand who we're up against. Yes, we've got the people smugglers, we've got the human rights advocates, we've got the Labour Party. Let's not forget them. They will frustrate this at every turn. They want to see us signed up to every human rights law, and they want an open border policy. But we're up against all these people in order to ensure that it's the British government who determine who comes to this country and in what circumstance. I don't understand what is controversial about that, to have our own immigration policy decided by the elected government of this country, and that's why we need to make sure that this bill is as watertight as possible. So, look, I'm looking forward to the government publishing their legal advice a bit later. I'm looking forward to more meetings with colleagues, and I'm hoping the government, when it comes to committee and report stage, will go that one step further, tighten this legislation and make sure that these people people won't be able to frustrate the will of the British people.
It's quite hard to keep track of everything that's going on. A very frenetic day in Westminster. People will have heard of lots of different groups of Conservative MPs meeting, 5 of them at 12 o'clock. There are 2 meetings later, one for the sort of Common Sense group and one for the One Nation group. It's sort of starting to seem like there isn't one Conservative party. There are about 15 Conservative parties on this issue. But I suppose the question to you, Paul, is who will you most be listening to? What will the different sort of arguments, which ones will you weight most heavily? And most crucially of all, will you be attending this smoked salmon breakfast with the Prime Minister tomorrow morning?
Well, look, I mean, I understand how it can be confusing with different groups and different parts of the Conservative Party, but we're all coalitions, aren't we? The Conservative Party is a coalition of voices on the right of British politics. The same goes for the Labour Party on the left of British politics. And I guess what this is all about is just ensuring that this bill is in the best possible shape, because this is last chance saloon at the moment. The British people really do expect us to get control and to get to grips with our immigration policy, and of course, and our borders, and that's not unreasonable. It should be for the British government, as I say, elected by the British people, to determine who comes to this country and on what circumstance. That is not controversial, but it's just been blocked by courts, people using human rights laws to infer all sorts of different things. The same human rights laws, by the way, that ensure that prisoners have access to pornography in prison. I mean, the people who drew up these human rights laws, the ECHR, in 1952 must be turning in their graves to think that it's been used for things like this. This is what we have to overcome, and this is why it's so complicated and sometimes so frustrating. As for your question about will I be attending the meeting tomorrow morning, actually I have been invited and I'm desperately going to try and make it work. I'm just going to find someone else to take my kids to school.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Paul Bristow, Conservative MP for Peterborough there in Westminster. I mean, I don't know how I can talk about a united party when different groups are getting different legal advice on the government's own policy. It is, if you think about it, it is rather ridiculous, but anyway.
No, and it does remind us all of those Brexit years.
Yeah.
We had all of these different groups of MPs popping up and sort of briefing against each other, and it does generate this perhaps sense of a lack of control, which for a government which still has a significant majority in the House of Commons, frankly, it doesn't feel like they have a majority at all.
No, it's hard to be confident in the government's policy when there are different groups, as we said, within the Conservative Party, all having their separate discussions and different legal advice.
Yes, well, we'll get to that and so much more. Thank you so much to our panel. We'll be back with you, of course, next hour, and more to come after this.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Afternoon, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. After a fine Monday for most of us, we're back to some heavy downpours tomorrow and some gusty winds also starting to head into Northern Ireland through this evening. Ahead of that, we've had a few showers today over eastern Scotland. They'll keep going, but for many it's a fine evening. Here comes the rain, though. Could cause some problems in Northern Ireland as it lingers for most of the night. Potential for a bit of flooding, so we do have a Met Office yellow warning in place. The rain will move through across England, Wales and into southern Scotland. A mild night tonight in the south, but pretty chilly across northern Scotland. Touch of frost just about possible. That rain will then spread into parts of southeast Scotland, northeast England tomorrow, where again likely to linger, and because it's been so wet it could cause some further issues. In the south, heavy showers likely tomorrow. Potential for some thunderstorms, even hailstones likely. For many it's a cloudy day with rain on and off. Some drier and brighter spells. Quite mild in the south, double digits, maybe even into the teens, but chilly again further north. Touch of frost on Wednesday morning across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Further outbreaks of rain, but not as heavy across these eastern areas during Wednesday. So quite a grey day for eastern England, but elsewhere it's actually turning drier and brighter through the course of Wednesday. This weather front will bring a bit of rain in on Wednesday night, but look at this, high pressure moving in from midweek onwards, and that should start to dry things out.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's on your teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show, every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's Monday, the 11th of December. Still to come today.
Rwanda crunch time. The chair of the ERG has said in the last few minutes that the government should pull the bill as it has too many holes in it. But the ERG did stop short of formally opposing the legislation. Could they still back it come tomorrow? And what concessions might be brought about?
And a busy day for the Prime Minister as he faces the COVID inquiry. The former Chancellor says he doesn't recall an email saying measures were at the riskier end of the spectrum.
And XL bully attack. More bad press for owners of the XL bully dog after another troubling scene was witnessed by terrified commuters at London Stratford Station. What did you make of what Mark Francois had to say, Tom?
I think there is more nuance than some of the headlines suggest. Yes, he did say, ideally, the bill would be pulled, they wouldn't be voting on it at all tomorrow, and something stronger would be put forward at a later date. Thing is, that's just not going to happen, is it? I find it very, very unlikely the government will pull this bill, and so the ERG has a decision to make. Do they vote for something imperfect as it might be and try and tighten it up at report stage, or do they decide to blow up the whole process, which is a weighty decision? And If the bill fails, does that make it more or less likely that tougher legislation will come about? Because it's not just the groups like the ERG that are voting here. Tonight, the left of the Conservative Party meets to decide all of this. And then, even if it does pass through the House of Commons, there's always the House of Lords.
I just think for everyone looking at this situation, watching this situation at the heart of government, it just looks like such a mess. And yes, you can argue that it is a good thing that there are more eyes on this legislation, digging through the legal ramifications and potential legal challenges and trying to make the legislation work. But equally, it just looks like a party fighting with itself.
It looks completely chaotic, and these were the scenes we saw in 2019 when the Conservative Party didn't have a majority. But let's now cross to Chris Hope, who is with the chairman of the ERG, Mark Francois, now.
Yeah, Tom, Emily, I'm with Mark Francois, who's the chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs. Mark Francois, you've said just now this bill should be pulled. That is a disaster for your government. Why are you saying that?
Well, because the Star Chamber of Legal Experts, chaired by Sir Bill Cash, spent nearly a week scrubbing this bill, forgive me, and they concluded this. In summary, the bill overall provides a partial and incomplete solution to the problem of legal challenges in the UK courts being used as stratagems to delay or defeat the removal of illegal migrants to Rwanda. A partial and incomplete solution. So the bill, as drafted, is not really fit for purpose. So the consensus of a meeting of 5 different backbench groups that I've just finished chairing was that the government, rather than plough on regardless, would be better to pull the bill and to come back with a better draft that doesn't have all these holes in it.
But pulling the bill means a new treaty. A new treaty means delay, delay, delay. Is that what you want?
It doesn't necessarily mean a new treaty, but it does mean a bill that uses language that wouldn't allow individuals to have endless appeals in the courts. The way, and the Star Chamber have given chapter and verse on this, and it's all now up on the Lawyers for Britain website. So any of your viewers, any citizen of the UK can read it for themselves. We've published it deliberately as a public service. This bill means that individuals can keep tying the government up in legal knots. That's why it needs to be redrafted.
It says in the small print of your legal review today that it needs very significant amendments which would change the character of the bill and is outside of the title's scope. That means any offering of amendments you might get overnight from the whips ain't going to work, right?
Well, the bill, because of the shape of it, because of its style, if you like, its legal structure, would be quite difficult to amend. It would be far better to withdraw the bill and come up with something which is much better written right from the word go.
We told this to the whips. Are they aware of your feelings? Rishi Sunak is in the COVID inquiry. What would be your message to him right now?
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister will be very busy with the COVID inquiry. We realise that. I'm sure the whips will... I was a whip once, Chopper. I'm sure the whips will have picked up on the outcome of that meeting. I should add, there's another meeting this evening at 6 p.m. of the New Conservatives, so they were at our meeting. They've issued an open invite to any of those 5 backbench groups to go to their meeting at 6 p.m. The additional thing I think to mention on their behalf is that Robert Jenrick, who resigned over this bill on a point of honour, he will be addressing that 6 o'clock meeting.
There's a man behind us holding up a sign saying, talking about hell and Jesus saves in hell. Do you think there's a snowball housing chance of this measure getting through tomorrow in the Commons?
I'm a politician, Chopper. I'm not a priest, so I'm not going to venture on questions of heaven or hell.
This could be a confidence vote in the government now, couldn't it? If they can't get this through tomorrow, this government surely could call an election.
I think now that the Star Chamber, who I think most people accept, know their business. They've been through it with a fine-tooth comb, a forensic analysis. They've concluded that the bill isn't really fit for purpose. I very much hope that rather than, plough on and damn the torpedoes, the government will listen, exercise common sense, pull the legislation and come back with something that is fit for purpose.
What matters more, though, maybe a bill which sort of might work, or collapsing the government?
I don't think it's an either-or choice, Chris, if I may. We've had 2 previous legislative attempts at this. The Nationalities and Borders Bill, that didn't quite work. The Illegal Immigration Bill, that didn't quite work. This really is the last chance, so the government will be well advised to get it right.
Mark Francois, thank you. Well, you heard there from Mark Francois, the chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs. He's saying this bill hasn't got a chance. The government should pull it. Frankly, where this takes us next, we're not quite sure. Back to you in the studio.
Really fascinating stuff there, Chris. It seems that Mark Francois sounds like a man who wants to vote against this bill, although, of course, there are other members of the ERG who haven't made up their minds. Some are voting for it. I suppose there's a question, Chris, whether the ERG will vote as one block on this.
Yeah, they didn't vote on how to vote in the meeting, if you forget my tautology there, in the meeting just now. They're going to meet again tonight at 6. I understand another meeting is planned for tomorrow. Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, addresses them tonight. We're into a very topsy-turvy rollercoaster 36 hours here in Westminster, which could result in an unprecedented historic defeat for the government, which could result in, dare I say it, an early election. I'll leave that thought there.
Yes.
High stakes indeed.
Leave us on that one. Thank you very much, Christopher Hope, our political editor. Thank you for grabbing Mark Francois for us so soon after his statement. That was great to hear from the boss of the ERG, Mark Francois. He never shies away from a debate, does he, Mark?
No. Punchy stuff there, punchy stuff.
Yeah.
And again, saying that the bill should be pulled. Whether or not the government acquiesces to that demand remains to be seen. And it is worth noting that there are some members of the ERG who have said that they will be voting for the legislation. Michael Fabricant has, in the last 10 minutes, released a statement saying that he, as a member of the ERG, will be voting for the legislation as the only way to get things done. So perhaps not a uniform view there.
Well, we spoke to Michael Fabricant last week, didn't we? So perhaps we can get him back on to understand his decision, why he's taken this decision. But the infighting continues, the competing briefings continue, legal and otherwise. We shall wait for crunch time tomorrow when the vote actually takes place and see how many do vote with the government.
But something else that is continuing, of course, is the COVID inquiry, with the Prime Minister taking the hot seat today. Of course, he was the Chancellor at the time of the pandemic. Rishi Sunak has been giving evidence throughout this morning and indeed this afternoon. And this piece of evidence really caught my eye, because there has been a narrative formed that the scientists were saying one uniform thing and the politicians, these dastardly politicians, were sometimes going against the scientists. Perhaps it wasn't quite that way. Let's listen to what the Prime Minister said on the advice from SAGE.
You know, my strong recollection of those few weeks in March was that advice was put to the government, to the Prime Minister from SAGE, and advice was followed pretty much imminently on the same day in most cases, if not all cases, during that period. The advice changed from SAGE during that period, but the government, when the advice changed, the government acted. The Prime Minister didn't say, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to change. We were sitting there, we got the advice about when we should implement self-isolation, household isolation, originally not to close schools, not to ban mass events. Things changed, particularly on the 16th of March. That's when the advice from SAGE changed considerably about the speed of implementation. But again, Prime Minister reacted. Schools were closed on, I think, that was announced on the 18th, because that was put before the committee at the time. And again, that was just acted on immediately, I think the same day, both on the 16th and the 18th. I think the Prime Minister stood up the same day and announced those decisions. And again, even up to about, I think, the 19th of March, the view from SAGE, the view from the Chief Medical Officer was that the existing measures that had been announced, if there was, in their words, 75% compliance, they should do the trick.
You know what my takeaway from that is, Tom? Because I know you have your views. But mine is that the scientists were fallible just as politicians were. Get things wrong, get things right, have different interpretations of the data, of the science, and mistakes are made.
Yes, and we can't forget that scientists changed their minds on the advice of masks, on the advice of whether or not this was surface transmission or airborne transmission. So many different pieces of knowledge were learnt and unlearnt throughout that period. But the most fascinating thing for me is that there is this weird narrative that the scientists were saying sort of from January that we should all lock down, when they weren't. They were advising precisely the opposite at the start. And right up until the 19th of March, they were saying voluntary measures, the measures that were already announced, would suffice. They changed their mind and then the government changed policy.
Yeah, it did sometimes feel like decisions were made on a whim as well. But I want to hear from Rishi Sunak on how the decisions were made for lockdown and to what extent the economy was taken into account. That was, after all, his brief. But we'll also hear about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which has been characterised as, well, very negatively by some parties. Although Kate Nichols from the hospitality sector earlier said it was a lifeline for hospitality businesses. But we're going to go back to the Rwanda story, our top story of today, because we have Scott Benton, independent MP for Blackpool South. Scott, thank you for joining us. We heard from the ERG. They recommend that the government pull this bill and revise it because they don't think in its current form it is good enough, it is tough enough to stop the boats. Will you be voting with the government on this bill as it is?
I'll be speaking to colleagues throughout the day and digesting the ERG's report before making a decision ahead of the vote tomorrow. This single issue has by far and large been the single biggest issue of concern for my constituents over the last few years. And I'm concerned with the bill as it stands. And if it doesn't do what we all want to see in terms of stopping the boats and ensuring that those who come here illegally can no longer stay, then frankly, the bill isn't fit for purpose. And I'm extremely concerned with the initial feedback I've heard from the ERG this morning, and I will be speaking to colleagues ahead of the vote tomorrow before making a final decision. But frankly, if the bill doesn't do what has been sold to us, then what is the point of proceeding with it at this stage? That's my concern at the moment.
Scott, it's interesting that the ERG, while saying that the bill should be pulled, hasn't yet made its mind up on whether or not it will advise MPs to vote for or against the legislation. I suppose you could view this sort of, in an ideal world, you wouldn't be starting from this place. But I suppose the bill is as written there, it's been drafted up, it's got all this legal advice behind it and all the rest of it. It's appearing before you tomorrow. Given that that's the starting point, we can almost ignore the ideal world scenarios and you sort of almost have a binary choice here. Well, perhaps a three-way choice, for, against or abstain. Do you believe that it's possible the bill could be tightened up at a later stage, after being passed in second reading? Could it be tightened up at report stage, in your view?
Those are the questions which colleagues are currently discussing at present, Tom. There would be potentially an opportunity to tighten the bill up and to eliminate the possibility of further legal challenges and these vexatious cycle of complaints from those who we should be deporting. Those questions could be reviewed at the committee stage, but I am concerned about some suggestions potentially that they may not in fact be in scope of the bill. And I think, speaking to some ERG colleagues over the last few moments, that is a position of some of those colleagues, that if those possible amendments were not in scope at committee stage, then frankly that begs a question as to whether or not the bill could or arguably should be pulled at this stage before the committee stage then proceeds. Clearly every single Conservative colleague will have to make a judgment call on this issue, but I'm listening to my constituents, and if this doesn't do what we all want to see in terms of stopping the boats, ending those endless cycles of vexatious and vexatious litigations, then frankly we will be back at square one with months to go later on next year to a general election, having not solved this single issue, which of course the Prime Minister has made one of his top 5 pledges.
Scott, it's very difficult. Lots of our viewers and listeners are writing in who may well have been supportive of the Rwanda plan initially, and they're fed up. They're starting to think this isn't the right plan for stopping the boats. It's coming up against legal challenge after legal challenge. The government hasn't stopped a single boat, hasn't sent a single flight to Rwanda. Is it time for a plan B, actually? You've got the ERG saying that this isn't going to stop the legal challenges. It's getting rather frustrating.
Well, this is a plan B. Obviously, if we had have seen a different result with the court processes over the last few months, then we wouldn't be in this position. This is the Prime Minister's plan B, and colleagues now have a decision as to whether or not they are going to support this bill tomorrow and then try and amend this potentially through the committee stage in the early new year, or frankly, whether or not they don't think it's fit for purpose at this stage and they will potentially vote against it tomorrow. My constituents and millions of people in this country are sick and tired of the position we now find ourselves in. We've had two significant acts of Parliament which have gone through this building over the last few years, and on both of those occasions we were led up the hill as MPs. We were told the bills were fit for purpose, we were told they would be good enough to stop the small boats, and frankly they weren't. And I'm quite upset that some of the comments and suggestions made as those bills were going through Parliament about potential notwithstanding clauses around the ECHR and our international obligations weren't listened to, because if they were, I suspect those pieces of legislation would have been in a better position to actually stop the boats. But unfortunately, we are where we are.
Not an issue
the process of getting legislation on the book is sometimes a bit messy, but what I would appeal to the British public is, bear with us, let's see what happens with this piece of legislation, and then...
Sorry, Scott, is there not an issue here with regard to the notwithstanding clauses? Because, of course, if you want to deport people from the United Kingdom, you need to deport them to somewhere. Now, for better or worse, the country that the government has decided to do the deal with is Rwanda. There's nowhere else that we would, unless we did returns agreements with all 196 countries of the world, which I think is probably unlikely, you need a place to deport people to. Rwanda itself is saying that if there are these blanket notwithstanding clauses in the legislation, they would not support the deal. Doesn't that create an almost impossible bind for the government?
I think you've hit the nail on the head as far as the Prime Minister's position, Tom. The Prime Minister's been quite clear over the last few days saying this is the best possible deal and the best possible option which Rwanda would have signed off on, and that's why he's brought the deal and the plan before us, which we will now vote upon tomorrow. Clearly, in terms of the last few years, I think we've left ourselves now in a position with very, very limited time before the next general election to try and get legislation on the books and deal conclusively with this issue. The British people will be watching closely, and of course they will judge us on our ability at the next election as to whether or not we have actually stopped the boats. The PM says this is the best deal he's possibly got, and that now presents colleagues with a decision about whether or not they support this and then possibly tighten this up at committee stage in the early new year. I'm probably likely to support the bill tomorrow. I will be in meetings with colleagues later, but unfortunately we are now left in a position where essentially this is a take it or leave it piece of legislation, and if we want to have any chance whatsoever of trying to stop the boats and make sure we can get these planes off the ground to Rwanda, then we need to see legislation go through, and that's probably why I'm minded to support the bill.
Thank you very much. Scott Benton, thank you for your time, Independent MP for Blackpool South. So likely to support the bill, regardless of what the Star Chamber lawyers have said,
but
that
of course,
it doesn't go far enough.
More meetings at 6 p.m. So it's going to be really fascinating. If the bill passes at all, by what degree it passes, which can of course affect the legitimacy it's seen by the Lords. There is so
the Exchequer, huge instability in the government. We seem to be back to that position now with the latest Conservative Prime Minister's authority shredded once again. And it really is time to give the British people their say, rather than having a government in office where, frankly, its only purpose is trying to secure its own survival, really isn't in the interests of the country. I think it is for the British people to have their say as soon as possible. And that, frankly, is what the Prime Minister should be doing, rather than just continuing in this way, causing damage to the country, which is what's happening.
How will you be voting on the bill tomorrow, and how will your party, when you speak for Labour as well tomorrow?
We won't be supporting the Rwanda plan. We believe it is an unworkable, failing, astronomically expensive scheme. So far, the government has spent £290 million, and that, at the moment, has produced travel to and from Rwanda for 3 Conservative Home Secretaries. And frankly, the government is just continuing to throw good money after bad on this scheme, when actually what they should be doing is the difficult, painstaking work that's required to stop people crossing the channel in these very vulnerable small boats. And first and foremost, I would suggest redirect that money to a new cross-border policing unit within the National Crime Agency that can bust the criminal smuggler gangs, get a grip of the asylum system here in the UK, 165,000 people at the moment stuck in it, 56,000 in hotels, and get the returns agreement.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these 3.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Well, earlier Mark Francois from the European Research Group said the government should pull the Rwanda bill because it has too many holes in it, he says. But he did not say how he and his colleagues in the ERG would vote when the bill comes before the Commons tomorrow.
Yes, it's an interesting conundrum. Will the ERG speak as one voice? Will these 5 different groups of various right-wing factions of the Conservative Party vote together, or might their coalition crumble under the pressure of the whips? Well, let's speak to Olivia Arkley now for the latest analysis. And Olivia, the whips must have been having a very, very busy time, keeping track of not just over 350 MPs, but dozens and dozens of groups of them.
Well, absolutely. Life has been very, very difficult for the whips. And in the last sort of half hour or so, the government has really hit back against Mark Francois and the ERG. The government has said that, reiterated, I should say, that the bill as it stands only makes very, very narrow provisions for people to potentially not be deported to Rwanda. In short, the ERG's problem with the bill is that it isn't tough enough in that individual migrants would be able, hypothetically, to complain that it was illegal for them specifically to be deported to Rwanda. The bill would rule that Rwanda is a safe country, but individual migrants could, in theory, claim mitigating circumstances. Now, the government has said this morning that it will be very, very difficult, in fact, for individuals to claim mitigating circumstances. It's admitted that it isn't possible for Parliament to rule that Rwanda would be safe for all possible individuals who might be deported there, but it suggests that the only possible way that a migrant could get out of being deported to Rwanda would be, say, if it was unsafe for them to fly in the later stages of pregnancy, or if they had some sort of illness, complicated illness that would be impossible to treat in Rwanda. Essentially, it's a reiteration of what Rishi Sunak said about a week ago, which was that the government's position and the ERG's position are only about an inch apart. But it just shows what a big clash we're heading for tomorrow. The government has essentially dug its heels in this morning, says it's not going to seriously amend the bill. There might be little tweaks, but it doesn't sound like any serious amendments from the government side are likely at all. And the ERG has said that essentially the government need to pull the bill and rewrite it completely. As you say, Tom, the ERG hasn't actually said that it will vote against the bill at this stage. They're going to be talking about it more tonight, etc. But after saying that it should be pulled completely, it's very difficult to see how they could then go on and vote for it tomorrow. So we are heading for a pretty huge clash.
Also, even if an individual migrant fails to challenge their deportation in the domestic courts, they can refer their case still to Strasbourg, to the ECHR. That's another level, isn't it? That's a potential for more legal challenges, and this is what the ERG is so worried about.
Well, absolutely, and that's why the ERG and Suella Braverman wanted to go for a full-fat option whereby no one could, under any circumstances, go to the courts and say that it was unsafe for them personally to be deported to Rwanda. The government says that's just not possible. There will be a few people, and the government maintains that it will be very, very few people who it is not safe for them to go to Rwanda, and the bill has to leave some wiggle room for those exceptional individuals. That's the government stance, but as you say, the ERG has said over and over again that there are just too many holes in this bill. So it's all to play for tomorrow. The other factor, of course, is where the left-wing MPs in the Conservative Party, the One Nationers, as they call themselves, are going to fall. It's thought that they will probably fall in line behind the bill, but I've heard a few of them say that they would be prepared to vote with Labour, and definitely a few more would abstain. So it is still quite possible that Rishi Sunak cannot get this bill through Parliament. And where on earth does that leave his premiership?
Goodness me, I just want to say Spencer's written in something. Thank you, Olivia. Appreciate your time on this. He says, the Tory party is so fragmented that it's like 5 smaller parties joined as one. What we technically have is a coalition government. Does feel like that when it comes to this particular policy, that's for sure.
Well, 'twas ever thus, to a certain extent. All parties are coalitions. And I suppose what First Past the Post does is sort of force them into 2 big blocks, more or less. I mean, the Labour Party has lots of factions as well. I suppose just sometimes they're much more visible than at other times.
They're not fighting so much in the Labour Party at the moment, at least.
Maybe it's because so many of those that would have done the fighting have been booted out. I don't know.
There you go. There you go. Restore order. That's what
actually, hang on. I say that, but I'm completely wrong. We just had the largest mass resignation from the shadow front bench that we've seen since the last Prime Minister was toppled.
Yes.
I mean, it's not all harmony on the Labour side, is it?
I did think that as soon as those words left my mouth, but I thought I'd leave it to you to correct her.
It is interesting, though, isn't it? You know, the Tory party tears itself apart and media focuses on it, I suppose because it is the government, but the Labour Party has been tearing itself apart over Gaza. You've had the Scottish Labour Party voting differently from the leadership of the English Labour Party, all the rest of it. It's not getting as much airtime.
Well, here we go. Our leaders do not have the authority they once had, perhaps, or was it ever thus?
Yeah, or maybe it's just sort of 24-hour news and social media and all the rest of it that exposes the divisions in a greater way than... I mean, Churchill never had to deal with this stuff, did he?
Well, I mean, if you're going to have press statements outside Portcullis House to discuss legislation that's going through tomorrow, that creates a media storm, does it not? But coming up, we will have our panel in the studio. They'll be helping us to react to Rishi Sunak's breaking revelations about his Eat Out to Help Out scheme. But first, it's your news headlines.
Thanks, Emily. Here are the headlines at 2:32. The government's Rwanda legislation provides a partial and incomplete solution, according to the so-called Star Chamber of Lawyers. A legal team for the ERG group of Tory MPs says the plan may be the toughest action yet, but it doesn't go far enough to achieve the Prime Minister's stated aim of stopping the boats. MPs are due to vote on the bill tomorrow, but ERG chairman Mark Francois says a complete rewrite might be the only option.
We all want to stop the boats. There have been 2 legislative attempts at this already. The Nationalities and Borders Act, that didn't quite work. The Illegal Immigration Act, that didn't quite work. So this is kind of 3 strikes and you're out, isn't it? So what is really important is if we're going to put a bill through Parliament, to have a piece of legislation which is fit for purpose. As the bill is currently drafted, it isn't.
The Prime Minister has defended what he called vigorous debate among senior government figures during the pandemic. He said disagreements were appropriate when making such significant decisions. Earlier, Rishi Sunak began his evidence at the COVID inquiry with an apology to those who'd lost loved ones. Speaking outside the inquiry, family members of those who died during the pandemic said the Prime Minister's words weren't enough to address the damage caused.
Today, what the Prime Minister should now take credit for was releasing a new wave of death and disease. Rishi Sunak's one-man mission to torpedo lockdown to gain a competitive advantage resulted in the false economy of sacrificing tens of thousands of lives to save the economy. Today, the COVID bereaved do not accept his empty words of sorrow, and it is of note that the Prime Minister has failed to utter one word of apology.
Now, if you're hoping for a white Christmas, you may have to settle for a wet one. 44 flood warnings are in place across England, with heavy rain and high winds expected. Yellow warnings for rain have also been issued for eastern Scotland from tomorrow morning until the early hours of Wednesday. It follows a weekend of washouts with storms sweeping across the country. Those are the top stories, and you can, of course, get more on each of those. Just visit our website, gbnews.com.
For a valuable legacy your family can own, gold coins will always shine bright. Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Here's a quick look at today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2578 and €1.1688. The price of gold is £1,585 and 33 pence per ounce. And the FTSE 100's at 7,516 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Well, Emily, you'll never guess what's happened.
What, Tom?
The moment the nation has been waiting for. We've all sat on tenterhooks for this very moment at the COVID inquiry. Rishi Sunak has finally been asked about Eat Out to Help Out.
Goodness me, you won't want to miss this. What is he going to say? We'll be back very shortly.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on this Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show, every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Right, now we promised you the very latest on Rishi Sunak in the COVID inquiry with regards to the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which now has become very controversial. Our reporter Ray Addison is live to give us the latest. Ray, what is the latest? What's happened? What's Rishi Sunak said about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme?
Good afternoon to you both. Well, Rishi Sunak facing a bit of a grilling this afternoon. Let's say things have heated up. No mistake here at the COVID inquiry. Of course, Eat Out to Help Out, Rishi Sunak's scheme from the Treasury, introduced after the first lockdown in August of 2020, and quite a defensive Rishi Sunak, facing questions from Casey Hugo Keith, the inquiry's lead counsel. Rishi's saying that the scheme was very successful, very popular, but of course now there are concerns that it did fuel a spike in infections and deaths. Now, Rishi Sunak saying that he believed it was the right thing to do at the time, and he still believes that it was the right thing to do. The Casey then pushed back, pointing out that this concept, the scheme, was never put in front of the government's chief medical officer and other scientists. Rishi responded by saying that he didn't believe it was a risk, and there was never any concerns raised with him, and there was about a month, just under a month, between the scheme actually being announced and the implementation of Eat Out to Help Out. He says his primary concern was to protect millions of jobs, around 2 million jobs of vulnerable people who work within the hospitality sector. He also pointed out that those hospitality restrictions, many of them were being lifted anyway, and therefore this scheme was just in addition to that. Now, we know that at the time, the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Chris Whitty, subsequently branded the policy Eat Out to Help Out the Virus. Angela McLean, she's now the UK's Chief Scientific Advisor, she branded Rishi Sunak Dr. Death. And now, since the pandemic itself, there's been one scientific study that has found that areas with a higher take-up of this scheme did in the subsequent weeks see an increase in people testing positive for COVID, and then a decrease once the scheme actually ended, although there is much debate about the validity and significance of that study. Now, the Casey asked the Prime Minister, if the scheme was so good, so safe, so successful, why was it actually not extended at a later date? And Mr. Sunak said it was designed just purely to get a temporary response. He denied that there were subsequent concerns about the infection rates, and that's despite former Health Secretary Matt Hancock telling the inquiry that he later expressed concerns to the Treasury about the increased risk of transmission. Mr. Sunak saying he never heard that. He also says that Mr. Hancock has subsequently said that too much emphasis has been put on that comment, and that created quite a fiery response from the Casey himself, who said it's for this inquiry to decide what issues we focus on, not you, Prime Minister.
Well, Ray, thank you so much for bringing us that. Sounds like a testy exchange there between the Prime Minister and Hugo Keith KC. Thanks for bringing us that live outside the COVID inquiry. Well, joining us to discuss exactly what's going on in that inquiry, but also some of the other big stories of the day, is the former editor of the Sunday Express, Martin Townsend, and the former Labour MP, Simon Danczuk. Martin, let's start with you, because Ray there referenced the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, now controversial. I suppose it is interesting that they didn't revive it the following summer. Does that mean perhaps people in government thought it was unnecessary?
I think probably that people in government always have a look at the cost, and it probably was costing a lot of money, and some sort of equation was done, and they decided not to continue with it. I don't think it had anything to do with it, any suggestion that it was spreading the virus, and I don't remember reading anything about that. And I think Richie, for a scientist, I think it was a scientist, to label Rishi Sunak Dr. Death when scientists were continually giving completely inaccurate modelling. I mean, it's extraordinary to me in this COVID inquiry that the scientists seem to have being completely ignored, and the politicians are having their WhatsApp. You know, there was a whole argument this morning about, where's this WhatsApp message? Where's that WhatsApp message? Hugo Keith seems to be using it as a kind of witch hunt against the Tories and against the government, rather than trying to get to the truth of it. And the truth of it is, it was a pandemic. Nobody could predict anything. We've seen that. The scientists were continually predicting it all wrong. Politicians, responsible politicians like Rishi Sunak and I believe Boris Johnson at the time were trying to do the right thing and follow the science, which was frequently wrong. You know, this inquiry for me, it's necessary because we want to know what we need to do next time round. But they're going about it entirely the wrong way. Let's find out why that modelling was wrong. How can we put it right in the future? How can we in any way predict how a virus is going to react? We don't even know really whether it's crowded rooms or it's outside in the air where this thing travels the most.
I think we do know that sort of after 2 years of data, we can pretty well say that if you're having dinner outside in the big fresh air and everything's going everywhere, that's different from if you're...
Martin raises a very good point there, that the COVID modelling hasn't been under as much, hasn't been under the spotlight as much as politicians' WhatsApps and messages. And what I would say is that, you know, there's a disagreement here between Rishi Sunak and what Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty had to say. Chris Whitty and Vallance said they weren't asked about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme and whether it would be bad for spreading the virus. And Rishi Sunak says, oh, well, they had every opportunity that they could to raise any concerns if they'd had them about the scheme. I mean, who to believe?
Well, that's a good question, but I think we should believe the small businesses in hospitality who say this did a lot of good. It really saved their businesses. I think it was a smart, imaginative, creative policy solution at the time in exceptional circumstances. I thought it was a good move at the time, and I think even reflecting on it now, I think it was a smart move by the government. I think they had to take some action of some kind, and this happened to work.
But Simon, we saw the following summer, when restrictions were removed, people flooded back to these businesses. They didn't need an £800 million bung from the taxpayer to do so.
Well, you can say that now, and that's in reflection, but people did appreciate the offer that was there, and I think in terms of morale at this time, we forget what it was like during the pandemic. It was absolutely
mindset was
awful.
different the following year. People were more tired of the lockdown measures.
Yes, we had the vaccine.
And people were braver. We had the vaccine. At the time of Eat Out to Help Out, if I remember correctly, it's quite hard now, people were far more cautious. So this was perhaps was more needed
I suppose
at that time.
The flip side of that is we did this sort of August sugar rush, got people crowded into rooms, whatever, declaring the pandemic over a year and a half before it was actually over. Might it have been the case that if we were sort of more cautious then, we wouldn't have had such restrictive tiers that then came in September? Could we have had fewer restrictions later by being, rather than this sugar rush then restrict option, if we were more steady throughout
We should have had a more sophisticated approach to the lockdown, that's my view. We should have locked down the vulnerable and allowed people to make up their own minds about whether they are vulnerable, whether they need to restrict their actions, etc. We should have trusted the public more.
I agree with that, and I also think we have to bear in mind that life had to go on in some way, shape or form after the pandemic, and to allow loads of, to your point, Simon, about to allow loads of small businesses to go down, loads of restaurants to be ruined, people lose their jobs, etc., etc. Life had to go on after COVID, and we've seen now, actually, you know, the repercussions from COVID are going to go on for years and years and years.
Also, it's right to remember that, thankfully, we were able to continue working from home and were able to do our jobs from home. For a lot of people, they lost huge amounts of work, and of course the self-employed didn't receive as much in the way of money from the government. Shall we move on to a shocking video that we saw this morning, showing XL bully dogs, or what appears to be XL bully dogs. We don't know for sure if they are XL bullies, but a bit of a fight breaking out at Stratford Station in London.
Well, here's the images now, and it seems like these dogs have just gone berserk, unmuzzled as they are, and it really does sort of highlight the issue of these powerful dogs, very hard to control. You can see the way that one is just jumping after a man, pulling him to the ground. And it's very, very hard for people to control these powerful dogs that can turn on a moment's notice and sort of have this base instinct to attack. Because, Simon, I suppose What many people say, and the reason the ban has been brought in, is that some dogs have traits. All dogs have traits. Retrievers retrieve, pointers point, and dogs that came from dogs that were bred specifically for fighting have this instinct to fight.
Yeah, and what people will find most worrying about this is a very public place. It's on a train station. A woman with 2 dogs that she quite clearly can't control. It could have easily killed the gentleman that's been attacked. And the solution has to be twofold. We have to get rid of dogs that have been bred in that way, I'm sorry to say, but they have to be got rid of. And then we have to have much more stringent legislation against the owners of such dogs. I mean, it's the owners there should really face the full throttle of the law.
Martin, one of our GB News presenters, Pip Thompson, she's a lover of dogs, and she's absolutely adamant that this is down to the owners themselves and not the dogs. Where do you stand in the debate about, can a dog be bad, or is it always the owner that's bad?
Well, I think Simon's right about certain dogs are bred to do certain things. These dogs are huge, powerful. I mean, I don't know what they weigh, but they're more like small bears than they are dogs. I think for something like that to happen at a railway station, it's very lucky somebody wasn't killed there. So it looked for a moment there like one of the dogs was going to drag somebody underneath the train, which I think is absolutely astonishing. I grew up on a fairly rough council estate in North London, and in the 60s we had packs of dogs wandering around in the streets. And I remember being chased, when I was a kid, being chased on my bike by dogs. I remember people in the street being bitten by dogs. It's a terrifying thing when a dog turns on you. I've got a little dog, I'm a dog owner and everything, but when a dog turns on you, it's absolutely terrifying. When a dog turns on you that has the capability of killing you, these are weapons. And I think that the law should react to these in the same way they would to knives or guns. If you've got a dog like that and it's out of control on the streets and you're supposed to be in control of it, you may as well be carrying a knife or a gun, because it could kill a child very easily. We've had 6 people killed in a year.
Yeah, it's crazy. You can have a lifelong fear.
Yes.
If as a child you were chased by a dog or harmed by a dog. I remember my brother running across the entirety of a park, it seemed, because there was a dog chasing him. And I don't think the dog meant any harm, but it really can give you a fear for many years to come.
But Martin, you're so right that people... I think to some extent the argument that it's the owner comes because there's a certain type of individual who will buy the most aggressive dog, and the most aggressive-looking dog as well, as a status symbol. If they can't own a gun, they'll have this as an attack dog, as a guard dog, and they clip the ears, something that's illegal, but so many of these dogs have clipped ears to look even more aggressive and evil. And I think that, to some extent, sometimes bad people own these dogs, but there's also something in the DNA of these dogs that is more aggressive. But it's fascinating that
Controversial, that. Lots of people would disagree with you, although I tend to agree. Do we have time for Nigel Farage?
I think we might.
Because, yes, let's have a look. Oh, well, we don't have a clip there. Sorry, got that one wrong. No. But we want to discuss... Sorry, Tom. We want to discuss whether Nigel Farage would make a good Conservative leader, because it seems he's saying never say never when it comes to rejoining politics.
I think he's going to play a significant part in politics going forward. That's my prediction. I think there's going to be a shift to the right in this country, and a lot of it relates to immigration. There's going to be a shift to the right, and that creates a real opportunity for Nigel to shine in some way.
It's fascinating, Martin, because Nigel Farage has had not one sort of career, but almost he's already had another comeback, right? He got UKIP from nothing to winning the European elections, and then from scratch he built the Brexit Party, which then won the European elections. Could he do it a third time?
I think he could. I mean, one of the interesting things that watching him on I'm a Celebrity is the way that he quietly kept pushing the idea of people having different opinions, being able to debate in a fair way. When he was kind of being goaded into having arguments about Brexit by some of the other campmates, he'd make the point, look, I completely respect your opinion. I would hope you would respect my opinion. There was somebody in there that didn't even know he'd worked in Europe, you know, as an MP in Europe for many years. So he was on a sort of mission, really, to show himself as a face of fairness and democracy, which I think in many ways he is in this country. I think he's much, much better outside the Conservative Party, especially at the moment. Is much better, actually, working with the Reform Party, I would say, this time around. And yes, he definitely has a very good future in politics.
Yes, on that, it's worth saying that Nigel Farage was scathing of both the Conservative leadership and that of the Labour Party. So it doesn't look like he's going to be swooping in anytime soon, but who knows? Never say never.
Well, I suppose that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Simon and indeed Martin, for joining us and talking through those big stories. And thank you at home for watching along. We'll be back, of course, tomorrow from midday. But up next, it's Martin Daubney.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Afternoon, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. After a fine Monday for most of us, we're back to some heavy downpours tomorrow and some gusty winds also starting to head into Northern Ireland through this evening. Ahead of that, we've had a few showers today over eastern Scotland. They'll keep going, but for many it's a fine evening. Here comes the rain, though. Could cause some problems in Northern Ireland as it lingers for most of the night. Potential for a bit of flooding, so we do have a Met Office yellow warning in place. The rain will move through across England, Wales and into southern Scotland. A mild night tonight in the south, but pretty chilly across northern Scotland. Touch of frost just about possible. That rain will then spread into parts of southeast Scotland, northeast England tomorrow, where again likely to linger, and because it's been so wet it could cause some further issues. In the south, heavy showers likely tomorrow. Potential for some thunderstorms, even hailstones likely. For many, it's a cloudy day with rain on and off, some drier and brighter spells. Quite mild in the south, double digits, maybe even into the teens, but chilly again further north. Touch of frost on Wednesday morning across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Further outbreaks of rain, but not as heavy across these eastern areas during Wednesday. So quite a grey day for eastern England, but elsewhere it's actually turning drier and brighter through the course of Wednesday. This weather front will bring a bit of rain in on Wednesday night, but look at this, high pressure moving in from midweek onwards, and that should start to dry things out.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all